Annie, I'm going to talk about you. It goes way back 1960. I was in my office, and Ann-Margret she was about 18, 19 years old. She was going to college in Chicago. And she came into my office with a piano player. She's Mr. Burns. My name is Ann-Margret, and this is my piano player. And I heard you've done a lot for Bobby Darin. And I'd like to get into show business too. You should give me a start. I said, do you sing as good as Bobby Darin? She said, I might not sing as good as Bobby Darin, but I move as good as Bobby Darin. I said, well, let's go into the prop room. I've got a show booked for Vegas for Christmas and New Year's, but let me hear you sing. So we went to the prop room, and she sang 2 songs, and she was just great. I says, Annie, you're going to Vegas with me. And we went to Vegas, and I introduced her to the audience, and she was a riot. And then somebody told me that when she came off the stage, she started to cry. So I went over to her. I said, what are you crying about? She said, well, it's Christmas. I'd like to talk to my mother. I said, go in the dressing room and use my phone and charge it to me. Talk to your mother. Tell her you love her. Then I went on the stage. I did my act for about an hour. And I came off the stage, and she was just coming out of my dressing room. She talked to her mother for an hour. And I said, did you talk? She said, yeah, we cried and cried and cried. And I said, tell your mother to come here tomorrow, spend a couple of days with you. She said, my mother lives in Sweden. I said, she does. So I started to cry. That phone bill, that's quite a bit. Annie, I love you. Roger, I can say that. I know it longer than you do.
My goodness. Daddy would do that for me. Oh, golly. Thank you, Mr. Burns. I love you so much. I always have, and I always will. Ann-Margret, my story. In preparing for writing my book and making this recording, which is perhaps the hardest thing I've ever done, I told myself that I would conquer some fears and also wipe away some of the mist that had enveloped me for so long. Oh, I knew all about the Ann-Margret mystique. I was said to be a recluse, a fragile woman consumed by fear, a tragic heroine controlled by a strong husband. I was an enigma to many people, including those closest to me, and sometimes even to myself. I felt it was time to change all that, to embrace candor and a willingness to try new things. I knew that it wouldn't be easy to cast off my innate reserve and privacy, but I believed that it was important that I write about the people and events that have shaped my life and career. Besides, if I waited too long, someone who didn't know me would do it, relying on press clippings and distortions. Now, as I see it, my tale is both unique and universal. I've had many successes, but also, like anyone else, my share of sadness. I'm a mom, a wife, and a crazy performer who likes to ride a motorcycle and kick up her heels. When certain music plays, I don't hear anything else. I'm sometimes mixed up, but I'm always me, Ann-Margret Olson Smith. Though I dropped the Olson years ago because I didn't want my parents to feel any embarrassment if there was negative publicity from my being in show business. I'm also quite proud. Shortly after I arrived in America as a little girl, my Uncle Arvid, a carpenter, fashioned a small wooden toy box for me and painted it a beautiful marmalade orange. As toys became less important, I used the box to store the keepsakes of my girlhood. Letters, ribbons, cards, awards, and treasures that meant the world to me. This recording is a lot like that great old toy box of mine. It's full of the things I've saved, the people I've treasured, the experiences I've been lucky to have. Good times, heartaches, triumphs, tragedies, celebrations, losses, mistakes, and incredible good fortune. I hope and pray that they're all in here. Sometimes there is a moment in your early years that haunts you and defines your past, your present, even your future. For me, it was auditioning for what would become my official performing debut, the Morris B. Sachs Amateur Hour, a Chicago television talent show. I was 13, with brown hair, a shaky smile, and a shyness so intense that I had sat paralyzed in the studio, tortured by nerves and fears. My terror had been palpable, visible to all around me, but miraculously ephemeral. The minute my name had been called, the minute the music started, the other Ann-Margret Olson had emerged, a prancing, gyrating, uninhibited performer, totally consumed by singing, dancing, and pleasing the audience. As I returned to my seat and savored the applause, I withdrew again and huddled at my mom's side. I heard someone say, "I can't believe she's the same girl. Turns it off and on." I can't believe she's the same girl. I repeated those words to myself again and again. I knew that I would hear that comment throughout my career, and I have. I suppose in a way that there are indeed two Ann-Margrets. I wish I could tell you that I fully know and understand both of them, but I'd be lying. I do know what makes Ann-Margret, the performer, emerge, and it's very literally the sound of music. I hear a beat, a tempo that moves me, and it's as if I'm transfixed. And it's been that way right from the beginning, when I was just a little thing with ringlets, big eyes, and an adoring audience of Swedish relatives. In Valsjöbyn, Sweden, where I spent the first 6 years of my life, music was the major release. In this tiny little town of lumberjacks and farmers, high up near the Arctic Circle, there were no movie theaters and few radios. But there was always the sound of my mom singing cheerful folk tunes, and by the time I was 3, she and I were harmonizing virtually every evening. My mom's brother, Uncle Kalle, often added his accordion. Of course, even then I was a ham, and I loved to take center stage. At 3, I certainly had no conception of what it meant to be an entertainer, but I wanted to please my mom, grandmother, and Uncle Kalle, just as I would want to please big-time audiences in the years to come. I had this desperate need to be a good little girl, to do what was expected of me, and in my house, that meant singing. I'm sure that some of this passion for music stemmed from loneliness. It was just Mom, grandmother, Uncle Kalle, and me for those first 6 years, and I missed the father I could not remember and fantasized about him terribly. I know Mom missed him too, but given her nature and his, this long separation was something that just had to be. Mother had lived in Valsjöbyn all her life and had been baptized Anna Aronsson. There was no real scandal and little gossip in town, where frugal, love-filled wooden homes dotted the rustic hillsides. There were no strangers where I grew up. Everybody knew each other. Even today, that insular world, free of strife, is my idea of a paradise. My father, Gustav Olsson, was a very strong man and a very taciturn one, but he was possessed by the same restless, roving soul of the Swedish navigators who'd set sail centuries before from Örnsköldsvik, the coastal city where he was born. At 17, Daddy set out for Canada. A year later, he hid beneath a truck and crossed into the U.S. He settled in Chicago, where he found work with the Johnson Electric Company. A few years later, in 1937, Daddy returned to Sweden to attend to family business. He also met Mother. She was 19, shy, and sheltered. He was 18 years her senior and had traveled extensively. The one thing Daddy had not anticipated while back in his native country was falling in love. He constantly mentioned his life in Chicago, and he tried persuading Mother to move there with him. But she wouldn't even consider such a far-fetched notion. So, Daddy canceled his plans and stayed. On Mother's 20th birthday, Daddy proposed. The next winter, they were married. Afterwards, they moved to Stockholm, where Daddy found work doing odd electrical jobs. Stockholm was frightening to my mom, who had never traveled beyond the provincial villages around Valsjöbyn. Within a few months, she was pregnant. If the baby was a girl, she'd be called Ann-Margret, after a Swedish swimming star that my mom admired. Not long after I was born, on April 28, 1941, Daddy began communicating with his old employer, Mr. Leonard Johnson, of the Johnson Electric Company in Chicago, requesting whatever papers were necessary for him to return to work in the U.S. Mother was steadfast in her opposition to such a move, and it created quite a strain between my parents. It was also a very difficult time. The world was in the grips of World War II. Sweden remained neutral, but the war still cast a pall of fright and uneasiness that was inescapable no matter where you lived. Even so, when Daddy's work papers arrived, he made plans to leave for the U.S. alone. Daddy's mind was made up. America was going to be our home. He would go first, but the family must follow. He'd send for us when passage was safe, he informed Mother. With the war raging, that was hard to predict. As Daddy made his way to the U.S. aboard a freighter, Mother closed our apartment in Stockholm and returned us to the more familiar, secure surroundings of Walshabeen. We weren't the only arrivals, though. Even though Sweden was neutral, more than 1,000 uniformed young Swedish men encamped within the boundaries of Walshabeen. With German soldiers in Norway a mere 10 minutes away, the soldiers were there for our protection. We moved in with my grandmother, whom I called Mumma, and Uncle Kalle. The soldiers packed Mumma's downstairs cafe room so tightly that it was almost impossible to walk from one room to the next without tripping over someone's boots. And I must admit, I loved the attention. They encouraged me to sing and dance, and I delightedly complied. But there was no replacing Daddy. By age 4, my curiosity about my father was insatiable. I pestered Mother constantly with questions about him. My relatives always told me that I resembled Daddy, but I wanted to hear more. Even better, I wanted to see for myself. Mother always gave me the same answer, someday. Really? Soon? It was then that Mother usually turned me around and gave me 3 kicks in the seat, a Swedish custom for good luck. It's called 3 sparkar. Still, to this day, I get my 3 kicks before going on stage. Soon, Ann-Margret, you must be patient. With the end of World War II, Daddy pressed harder for us to join him in Chicago. So, we prepared to leave Sweden and all the relatives. Mother tried to be brave, and I was elated, then terrified of leaving home, a syndrome that would exert itself more and more in the years to come. I would become both reclusive and an extrovert, the roots of which I now understand. On November 29th, 1946, Mother and I sailed into New York Harbor. I knew little about the new country I was moving to, but someone on the ship had told me about the Statue of Liberty and all that it represented. Beyond that was the imposing skyline of Manhattan. Our steamer docked at Pier 44, and right away Mother and I began searching the crowd for Daddy. We held hands, squeezing tightly. Mother said, "There's your Daddy." The moment I dreamed about for so long was finally here, and it was even better than I had imagined. He looked exactly as he did in his photographs, handsome and strong. Mother and I stuck close to Daddy while he claimed our trunks and loaded them into his car. Although he spoke English and moved with familiarity, everything was foreign to us. We might as well have stepped on the moon. Daddy played tour guide. He drove us around Manhattan, pointing out Central Park, the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, Times Square, and finally our hotel. But that was only the start of a great first night in this new country. Daddy took us out to dinner at a coffee shop. Then we went to Radio City Music Hall. I stared at the giant marquee above the theater, trying to make some sense of the words illuminated by the bright lights. We took our seats, and Mother and I admired the crushed red velvet. As the theater darkened, I reached out for her hand. Then the curtain rose. Daddy explained. He said, "First, we see a movie." I said, "A movie? What's that?" He said, "Just watch." The feature that night was The Jolson Story, the classic biography of entertainer Al Jolson. Though the movie was completely unfathomable to me, and the words and stories sailed beyond my grasp, I was captivated by the new, quite amazing experience. The next presentation, the show for which Radio City has always been famous, was much easier to understand. The stage filled with dozens of dancers, singers, and of course, the Rockettes. I was mesmerized. When the show ended, I was speechless. The grin on my face had everything there was to say about what I'd just seen. Daddy carried me to bed. This time when Mother tucked me in, she had help. I knew then that I would always try very hard to please my parents, and especially at this time, my father. I suppose when your father's absent for so many years, you fear that if you misbehave, he'll leave you again. I felt those days were over, but I would take no chances. Fox Lake, Illinois was about 45 minutes outside of Chicago. The woodsy fishing resort reminded me of Bolshevin. It even boasted more than a dozen transplanted Swedes, including relatives. Once again, music filled our house as it had in Bolshevin, and gradually, Fox Lake began to feel like home. Although I know it must still have been very tough on my mom, I never heard her complain. Not once. I was the same way. While I dreaded the fear and nervousness of starting a new school, I kept it to myself. I didn't protest or gripe. That just wasn't the way Swedish children behaved. Just as you're taught never to boast, you're taught to grit your teeth and trudge ahead in the cold, knowing warmer days will eventually come. And Mom watched out for me. She helped me make friends by signing me up for dance lessons at the Marjorie Young School of Dance. Although it was a financial stretch, both she and Daddy thought it was very important. From the first day, I loved going to class. I was at school the day in 1952 when Daddy's boss, Mr. Leonard Johnson, called Mother in a concerned, shaky voice. Gus had been hurt, he told her, badly hurt, and she was to come right away. At the hospital, she met Mr. Johnson, who told her Daddy was working on a building and had slipped and fallen 2 stories onto the concrete pavement, landing directly on his back. In retrospect, his fall was an eerie foreshadowing of my nearly fatal tumble from a similar height 20 years later. Both Daddy and I were really lucky to be alive. My father shattered his pelvis in 4 places. He also suffered numerous bruises, contusions, and sprains. When Mother entered the hospital room, he was unable to move or communicate. But Daddy received a good prognosis for recovery, though a slow one, and Mom phoned home with the news. Boy, we were all greatly relieved. Daddy spent several weeks in traction and then several more in the hospital. Then he was laid up for another 5 months at home. Not only was he debilitated, he was also devastated at not being able to support his family. Though he received some disability money as well as a bonus, the financial strain was severe. To help, Mom got a job as receptionist and caretaker for the Alton Nelson Funeral Home, which our neighbors co-owned in the nearby suburb of Wilmette. In exchange for Mother's services, we could live there rent and utilities free. This, of course, meant moving from Fox Lake and all the relatives, but we had little choice. For so long, I had been taught to be resolute, to accept adversity, but this time I had trouble meeting the family standard. The funeral home had a tiny apartment-like space, a family room, kitchen, bathroom, and living room that doubled as a room for the mourners. I slept on a fold-out sofa in the room where families waited before and after the services. This little room was adjacent to the viewing room. Sometimes I waited until 1 or 2 in the morning before I could go to bed. Those nights were long and sad. Mom, Daddy, and I would wait in the dinette area, watching TV with the volume extremely soft. When the last mourners finally left, I'd go into my room, fold out the sofa. There was always smoke from cigarettes, so Mom opened the windows while I curled up under the blankets. In the insecure, fragile world of childhood, the traumas of sleeping in close proximity to a casket were nothing compared with the devastation of starting another new school. It was as if I had come from Bolshevin all over again, and once again, I was plagued by the same anxiety and fear as before, perhaps even more. Then my 6th grade teacher, Mr. Hampton, discovered that I could sing. After class, he complimented my voice and asked if I would join the Glee Club. Not only did the Glee Club help my confidence, it also became the first outlet for my dreams of being an entertainer. We encountered some rough times after leaving Sweden. There was no question about that. But Mom somehow insisted that there was a bright side. We were a family, she'd say. As long as we had each other, everything would be fine. New Trier High School in Winnetka, one of the best schools in the state, was well known for its great music and drama program. As a freshman, I was more than a little intimidated by the school. Prohibited by my parents from dating until I was 16, I turned my attention to fitting in as best I could. In the summer of 1957, I went to a cheerleading camp in Indiana. Camp was supposed to last a week, but on the second day, a counselor pulled me out of practice and took me straight to the infirmary, where a doctor examined me and then quarantined me in a tiny cabin. I had the chicken pox. My parents arrived the next day and took me home, and naturally, I was devastated. A week later, on the morning of my appearance on the Don McNeil Breakfast Club, a well-known talent show syndicated out of Chicago, my face was still covered by the red spots left over from the chicken pox. "What am I going to do?" I cried to Mom. She was firm. "You aren't sick, so you will do your best." I had wedged my foot in the door of the Don McNeil Breakfast Club because one of Mr. McNeil's producers, Mr. Peterson, had a son, Tom, who was a friend of mine in school, and he had put in a good word. Once at the studio, I learned that Mr. McNeil was on vacation. However, his replacement was Ted Mack, the Ted Mack, of the nationally televised Original Amateur Hour fame. The makeup and hair people delicately tried to cover the spots on my face and brush my hair so that it would hide some of the spots on my forehead. But once it was time for me to sing Them Their Eyes, I underwent the usual transformation, the Ann-Margret shift from reticent to unrestrained. After my performance, Mr. Mack asked if I wanted to appear on his own show. Did I? But then I realized that an appearance on the Original Amateur Hour meant traveling to New York. Given our tight financial situation, I figured that Mr. Mack's offer was a wonderful compliment, but not likely. But I had the best stage parents in the world. Never pushy, always supportive and loving. With help from my godparents, they came up with enough money for the trip. Mother and I were so excited. It was a gilded moment, our first time back to Manhattan, the city where our journey in this country had begun 11 years earlier. Feeling that Then Their Eyes was my lucky song, I selected it for the show. But I lost to a gentleman who played a terrific rendition of Lady of Spain on a big Mexican leaf. My mother's teachings, my Swedish upbringing, had stressed humility, and I did my best not to feel disappointed. But all things considered, I felt like a winner because I got through the song. After that, there was no holding back my desire to perform. For the next couple of years, I would spend most weekend nights singing with Hal Monroe, an agent who also had his own band, traveling around Chicago and throughout Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Michigan, playing socials and clubs. Back at school, I progressed in the theater department. The real performing highlight of my high school career occurred during the 1959 Lagniappe, a talent show produced, directed, and performed by students. For my rendition of Heat Wave, which I choreographed, I slithered out from behind the grass door of a Tahitian set in a tight chartreuse dress, slid up my leg, slow danced center stage, and belted out, "She started this heat wave by letting her seat wave." Almost as soon as I began to move, there was a rustling in the audience by parents who thought my interpretation way too steamy. Ah, dear. There it was again, the other Ann-Margret, a sultry siren who really had no idea of how different she was on stage. After graduating, I planned on attending Northwestern, but I was torn between school and performing. Before leaving New Trier, I sought advice from my music and drama teacher, Dr. Peterman. I asked what he thought might happen to me as a performer in the world outside high school and braved for the worst. But Dr. Peterman smiled. "Look, kiddo, with your talent as a singer, dancer, and actress, plus your face, you could realize big things in Hollywood." Well, I was stunned. This man, who I respected, had articulated my innermost dreams. I gave Dr. Peterman a hug and left his office grinning from ear to ear. Still buoyed by my talk with Dr. Peterman, I plunged into life at Northwestern. One day at my sorority house, a sorority sister mentioned that a friend of hers, Scott Smith, was organizing a combo and needed a girl singer. Scott and I met several weeks later. Tall and dark-haired, he had already graduated from Northwestern and set his sights on show business. Scott sat down at the keyboard and I sang along. After a few numbers, I was hired, and rehearsals began a few days later. Over lunch at the Hut, a campus hangout, we dubbed ourselves the Subtle Tones. That's spelled S-U-T-T-L-E-T-O-N-E-S. It was Scott and I, Ring Warner was the bassist, and David Ziering was the drummer. As time passed, my time with the Subtle Tones overtook the hours I devoted to school. Ordinarily, I didn't get home until around 2 or 3 a.m. I found myself racing through the day in anticipation of the time when I could step on stage on the weekends. Somewhat predictably, perhaps, Scott and I started dating. My whole life was music, and my priorities were clearly shifting away from the campus. In late May, as I wound up my freshman year, Scott received a call from an agent. There was an opening at the Nevada Club in Las Vegas. Did we want the job? The engagement would last 2 weeks, commencing after school let out in June. The agent said there would be more work after that, and naturally we let ourselves dream of a big future. Our own manager tried to talk me out of it. Do you know how tough it is out there? I don't want you to get hurt. I've been warned, but I still want to try. Scott seemed worried. Ann-Margret, you know how strict your parents are. Do you think they'll let you go? I gave him a reassuring smile, but privately, I was doubtful. My parents and I had the big discussion about Las Vegas over dinner. I asked Scott to come for support, and he wound up explaining the agent's offer. When it came to business, I felt tongue-tied and preferred to let someone else explain things, a harbinger of my attitude towards Roger in later years. My parents were impressed by what the Subtle Tones had achieved in such a short time. They wanted me to have every chance in the world to succeed in whatever I wanted to do in life. They said yes. The night before we left, Daddy came into my bedroom wanting to talk. He apologized for not having a lot of advice to give me about show business. But maybe I've learned a few things that I can tell you about. Looking into my eyes, he patted my knee and smiled. I fought back tears. Then Daddy asked me a favor. Ann-Margret, I want you to promise me you'll never take a drink of alcohol. I had never had a drink, nor had I puffed a cigarette. You know I don't drink, Daddy, I promise. Now I know that Daddy struggled with alcoholism as a young man, and that he feared it was in the genes. As it turned out, he was right. Before we left, I made my decision to drop my last name and simply go by Ann-Margret. Not Ann, not Miss Margaret, but Ann-Margret. The four of us in the combo arrived in Las Vegas and found the club where we were booked. Then we discovered the club had extended the previous act, meaning we had no job. Scott got on the phone with the agent in L.A. who'd booked us into the Nevada Club. He said that he was very sorry, but as long as we'd come this far, we should continue on to L.A. and see what happens. We issued a collective shrug. At 19 years old, you take such matters in stride. We'd driven to Las Vegas from Chicago. How much farther was L.A.? It was dark when we arrived in L.A. We headed for Hollywood and checked into an inexpensive hotel on Sunset Boulevard. We called our agent. Every day, like clockwork, but the answer stayed the same. Sorry, kids, nothing yet. In the meantime, we rented a Spanish-style duplex in the Hollywood Hills. By July, our funds had dropped to where we subsisted primarily on toast, hard-boiled eggs, and water, but none of us wanted to give up. I found another agent in the phone book, Georgia Lund. She was great to us. She booked us for 2 weeks at the Villa Marina, a really lovely restaurant supper club in Newport Beach. We drove to Newport, checked into a hotel, and splurged at the grocery store for the first decent meal we'd had in weeks. Newport Beach was in the peak of its summer social season and a magnet for Hollywood's boating crowd. The Villa Marina was one of the most popular gathering places. As for my relationship with Scott, the difficult times we had been through had taken a toll. We agreed to remain friends. Soon I began dating actor Peter Brown, who starred on the popular Western series Lawman. Whether it was luck, talent, or a combination of the two, after the Subtle Tones' first engagement wound up, we managed to land 2 weeks at the Riverside Hotel in Reno. The room was cozy and the stage was large enough so that I could finally have some room to stray from the microphone. I did what came naturally when I heard good music. I snapped my fingers, tossed my hair, did whatever it took to convey the feeling of the words and the music to the audience. I suppose that was the genesis of the Ann-Margret frenetic feline moves. Believe me, I don't orchestrate all that much of them. It's a natural response to the music. One night, a man named Frank Taylor came backstage after the show. He was producing The Misfits, which was being shot outside of town. The movie starred Montgomery Clift, Clark Gable, Marilyn Monroe, and Eli Wallach. It was the talk of Reno. Mr. Taylor was generous in his praise and warned that he'd be back. Sure enough, several nights later, there was a small commotion in the back of the showroom. Frank Taylor was back with Montgomery Clift and Eli Wallach. The threesome came backstage after the performance and visited for a generous period of time. Before leaving, they invited us to the set to watch them film. It was the first time any of us had visited a movie set, and I was as nervous and excited as could be. Then Eli Wallach recognized me. He waved and came over towards me, and by his side was Mr. Clark Gable. We chatted briefly, although I didn't want to say too much, in part because I didn't want to say anything wrong. Later that night, I phoned home and breathlessly recreated for my parents my brush with Hollywood stars. I also explained how, just before leaving, I caught a glimpse of Marilyn Monroe. From the distance, Marilyn struck me as a beautiful woman with a porcelain delicacy. I sensed the special splendor and style that made her a star. I would have loved to have met Marilyn. I would have understood her, I think. To me, she was a vulnerable woman who only wanted to be accepted and loved, but somehow was mistreated, used, and often abused by Hollywood, the studio system, and by men. Just thinking about her makes me upset at how people take others for granted and often don't appreciate them until it's too late. Marilyn was one of those who wasn't helped soon enough. The Riverside Hotel extended us another 6 weeks, but at the end of August, the job ended and we finally had to contemplate the future. The other 2 members of the Subtle Tones opted to return to college. Scott chose to stick with it and see where it led. So did I. There wasn't even a question, just a proviso. I needed to get my parents' permission. I got it. As immigrant parents, I'm sure they harbored desires to see their only daughter get her college degree, but they never let on, and for this I will always thank them. They knew me so well and were willing to subvert their goals for mine. I was on my way. Scott replaced the rhythm section. We had another engagement, several weeks in the lounge of the Dunes Hotel in Las Vegas, the city of our first disappointment. The Dunes was big time. Tony Bennett headlined the main showroom. He commanded all the good set times, of course, while we played off-peak hours. It was a tough gig. People stood in line for tickets to see Tony Bennett, but during our set times, seats were available, and those who came into the lounge just wanted to talk, smoke, drink, rest. If they were entertained, so much the better. Still, we created a small buzz. After that, we went back to L.A., believing that we were in show business and not merely college students working on a lark. And with that came new, nettlesome problems that influenced the future of the group. One afternoon, Bobby Roberts, a manager that I had accidentally met the previous month, asked me to come in and explain that he wanted to sign me. Not the Subtle Tones, not Scott and me, just me. He talked about continuing in nightclubs, but also about my making records and movies. I honestly had not thought about doing anything outside of the Subtle Tones at that point, but it all sounded so intriguing. A few days later, he called. He said, "Have you heard of George Burns?" I might have been naive, but I hadn't just fallen out of a tree. Of course I had heard of George Burns. He told me that Mr. Burns was auditioning girl singers for a spot in his annual holiday show in Las Vegas. His reputation for discovering new talent was unsurpassed. I knew that I would have trouble resisting this, but I had one reservation. I said, "What about Scott?" And he said, "If you get the job, there's a spot for him to accompany you." So, in November 1960, Bobby drove Scott and me to General Service Studios, and I was totally disarmed by Mr. Burns. He said, "How you doing, kid?" He asked in that great gravelly voice of his. He puffed on his cigar. Now, since he didn't have a piano in his office, we walked to a nearby soundstage where an upright was pushed into a corner. Scott took off an empty bird cage that was on the top of an old dusty tarp covering the piano and dusted the keys. Mr. Burns, sensing my nerves, relaxed me with flirtatious one-liners. Then he settled into a chair and nodded. I did 3 songs: Bill Bailey, Have a Good Time, and Mac the Knife. As soon as I finished the last song, Mr. Burns stood up and walked toward me with a bright smile. "How would you like to go to Vegas and do the show with me?" Now, I heard the words clearly, but I didn't believe them, or rather, I couldn't believe them. I said, "Are you joking?" And he said, "Not unless you're paying me." I couldn't have wished for a better mentor than George Burns. He was professional, bright, funny, and above all else, kind, generous, helpful, and really sensitive to people's feelings. At this early stage of my career, I had already learned to distinguish the shadings of my performance anxiety. This time, as I faced the empty stage of the Congo Room, the Las Vegas Sahara Hotel showcase, I felt stark terror. In a few hours, the room would be packed with people staring at me. I heard Mr. Burns' familiar voice, "Annie?" Now, lots of people have called me Annie, but he's the only one who's ever done it in a way that doesn't bother me. I returned his smile, but then I noticed that his enthusiasm had quickly been replaced by a look of concern. He studied me carefully, slowly, puffing his cigar like a draftsman looking over complicated blueprints for errors. He said, "Is that the outfit you're wearing tonight?" I wore an orange-red velvet pantsuit, brand new and very chic. There was a long pause. He said, "What happened to the sweater and the pants that you wore to the audition? The tight sweater and the tight pants?" Then he told me something that I've never forgotten. He said, "Annie, people don't only want to hear your voice. They want to see where it's coming from." I turned around, hurried to my room, and changed. That night, the Congo Room overflowed. Sick to my stomach with anxiety, I watched the show from the wings until just before my cue. Off stage, Mr. Burns kissed my cheek for good luck. Then he introduced me as a girl straight out of her first year at Northwestern. I forgot about my queasy stomach and lost myself in the music. Mr. Burns congratulated me on a good show and paid me one of the ultimate compliments. He said, "Annie, every time I do a show, I go out loving my audience." He said, "Tonight, I saw that same look in your eyes." And I said, "That's how I feel." He said, "Don't ever lose it." Slowly, I drifted back to earth after working with George Burns. In January 1961, I settled into my LA apartment. I checked in with Bobby, my manager, and wondered what, if anything, would follow the Vegas engagement. But that conversation only underscored my naivete. From then on, I felt as if I were in an animated movie. In a period of 5 days, I met with the head of 20th Century Fox, scheduled a screen test, and I signed with RCA to make an album. It was soon clear that Hollywood was opening its doors to me. Scott was immensely talented, very gifted, and there was a definite chemistry between us. Yet clearly we would have to part. The U.S. Army intervened. Scott was called up by the reserves. Meanwhile, with a crew from Life magazine in tow, I met with director Robert Parrish. Mr. Parrish handed me a script, which was for the remake of State Fair, and explained that I'd test for the lead. I promise you the test will be no worse than 6 or 7 hours in the dentist chair. The only painful part of the screen test was a pre-dawn wake-up call the next day. By late morning, I was in front of the camera, playing the Jean Crane good girl part from State Fair. After lunch, I did the second half of my screen test, what was called the personality test. In addition to reading a scene, they wanted to see how I moved and sang. I changed into a red sweater and black tights and underwent a complete makeover. My hair was brushed wild, my eyebrows colored, and my lips painted bright red. I burst out laughing when I finally saw myself in the mirror. Back on the sound stage, I did several songs. I really got into it. With fingers snapping and hair flying, I moved across a wide swath of stage, showing my wild side. Afterward, the crew applauded. I was pleased, if slightly embarrassed. Nearby, Mr. Parrish leaned against a camera and talked to the reporter from Life. The kids are real schizo. But then came the really hard part, waiting for the studio to review my performance. In the interim, the Life crew traveled back home with me to meet my family in Fox Lake. One of my relatives threw a brunch, and the reporter and photographer got to meet all my aunts, uncles, and cousins. My Uncle Roy threw me over his knee and pretended to spank me as he'd done when I was little. Daddy and I danced the humble across the living room and into the kitchen where Mother was being interviewed. "How is it having your only daughter in Hollywood?" Mother thought a moment, then replied, "Boy, has our phone bill been big." After a few days in Fox Lake, the Life crew got their story and returned to L.A. I enjoyed this first encounter with the press, though in later years I would grow more wary. On January 17th, Peter Brown phoned. He was traveling to Wisconsin and had a brief stopover in Chicago. He wanted to know if I'd meet him for an early breakfast at O'Hare Airport. I arrived with my parents, and Peter, too, had someone with him, actor Roger Smith. Since I didn't watch much TV, I had no idea Roger starred on the popular series 77 Sunset Strip. Roger and I had a brief conversation, and I told him about my movie tryout. Many years later, he confessed that he said to himself, "Poor thing, this sweet, innocent baby will be devoured by the wolves out there." He never let on then, though. And after breakfast, I kissed Peter goodbye and told Roger that it had been very nice meeting him. He said, "Good luck. Maybe we'll see each other sometime in L.A." Sure, I smiled. I thought, what a nice man. But that was it. Yes, I noticed how handsome he was, but sparks just didn't fly then. I can't explain it, but I know they did later. Not long after, Robert Parrish telegrammed with news that my screen test had been terrific. Then Fox called and said they wanted to sign me to a 7-year contract. And on January 27th, Life magazine hit the stands with a 14-page spread. I was beyond thrilled. I was teetering on delirious. Less than a week after being home, I recorded my first RCA single, Lost Love, and the next day taped The Jack Benny Show. The breaks I got back then were incredible. Movies, music, television, plus mentors like George Burns and Jack Benny. How lucky could a girl get? I savored it all, feeling young and lucky and terribly happy. I was still a neophyte in Hollywood and had no notion of how one studio loaned its contract players out to another. My first movie wasn't going to be with Fox, but instead with Paramount Studios, with legendary director Frank Capra. Pocketful of Miracles would turn out to be his last directorial effort. I finished recording my first album in Nashville, where I hooked up with some of the best musicians in the business. Floyd Kramer played the piano, Chet Atkins was on guitar. I also worked with the Jordanaires and the Anita Kerr Singers. The album was titled And Here She Is, Ann-Margret, and was released in early March. The bouncy pop single, I Just Don't Understand, soared up the charts. In late May, I started work on Pocketful of Miracles, whose cast included Bette Davis. It was quite something to be getting my screen baptism playing opposite this movie legend. It would have been intimidating had she not been such a generous, patient teacher. My first close-up was an interesting experience. We'd done the scene several times. Each time I grew more intense, wanting to be perfect and please Mr. Capra. But all of a sudden, Miss Davis halted the action. No, we have to stop. Now, Mr. Capra could have gotten upset with her. After all, he was the director, and she'd usurped control of his set. But Mr. Capra was always a gentle, soft-spoken, intelligent, understanding man, and he got on well with Miss Davis. Yes, he asked. What is it? Where's Ann-Margret's hairdresser and her makeup person? It doesn't look right. Everything stopped, and everyone looked at me. When Bette Davis asked a question or made a demand, people reacted. She commanded respect. People came running. They fussed over my hair and face, and when they finished, Miss Davis ushered me to a quiet corner and inspected the work. Now, Ann-Margret, this is your close-up, and you want to look the very best you possibly can. All right? Yes, ma'am, I nodded. She led me back to my mark and took another long, careful look at me from straight on. Then she turned to Mr. Capra. She said, All right, now we can shoot. In September, I finally started work on State Fair, and though I had tested for the part of the chaste farm girl, I was recast as Emily, the bad girl, a switch based on my personality test. The wild Ann-Margret, the side that I couldn't control, had shaped my role. Director Jose Ferrer decided that my long hair, which fell to the middle of my back, should be dyed orange, a color called Titian to be exact. They felt it matched my character and captured the attention of the movie's naive farm boy, played by Pat Boone. Meanwhile, I turned my attention to the upcoming Academy Awards. Without my knowing it, there was an intense, behind-the-scenes lobbying effort to get me on the Academy Awards telecast as a performer. It worked. I was assigned to sing Bachelor in Paradise, one of the Oscar-nominated songs. I still have a vivid image of the sun setting over the ocean on April 9th, 1962, as Mom, Daddy, and I drove to the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium where the Academy Awards were being held. We avoided the throng of press and photographers by using the rear entrance, though of course nobody would have recognized me since my first movie had just been released. I received no introduction. The spotlight focused on the curtain. My hand slipped through the opening, and I snapped my fingers. Very snazzy. A snare drum provided the beat. Then the rest of the orchestra kicked in, and I danced out on stage. Bob Hope, the master of ceremonies, stepped out on the far end of the stage as the song wound to a close. I strolled over to him, stopped, gave him a long, provocative look, and disappeared off stage. Bob Hope looked almost startled as he said, "Who was that? I never saw her before. I thought it was a dancing pony." I planned on resuming my schedule as if nothing extraordinary had happened. However, my manager called. He said that his office was so inundated with calls that several temps were hired just to handle the phones. Bobby struck while the iron was hot. In retrospect, he should have been selective, but he signed me to a half-dozen pictures spread across Columbia, MGM, and 20th Century Fox. Virtually overnight, I was booked for the next few years. It looked great on paper. In reality, it would have been impossible to make all those films in the stipulated time span. But I didn't know about that. I was swept away by the excitement, while Bobby promised that was merely the start. I had no approval of scripts, cast, directors, nothing. I was being treated as a commodity, someone to be stuck in whatever film the studio decrees. But what did I know? I was no different from lots of girls who come to Hollywood willing to trust whomever is willing to help them. In the middle of all the excitement, Daddy suffered a mild stroke. And when Mom gave me the news, I made an impulsive but totally from-the-heart proposal. I asked my parents to move out to L.A. For a family as closely knit as mine, it made sense. I began shooting Bye Birdie. Birdie would captivate the hearts of audiences and make me, quote, an instant star, unquote. Such swift incandescence, I would learn, is not always the easiest way to build a career. Birdie was a satire about all the frenzy that erupted in the late 1950s when Elvis was drafted into the U.S. Army. I portray Kim, an all-American teenager from Sweet Apple, Ohio, who in the biggest publicity stunt ever is selected to appear on The Ed Sullivan Show and kiss rock idol Conrad Birdie goodbye as he sings One Last Kiss, a song written especially for the occasion. Ironically, I had never seen Elvis perform. I had missed his big appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1956. In the middle of shooting, my parents arrived and moved into my one-bedroom apartment on Cannon Drive in Beverly Hills. I gave my parents the bedroom, and I slept on the sofa, though I'm not quite sure how much rest I actually got. My mom said one morning, "You must be concentrating so hard, you were dancing in your sleep." 6 months after we finished Bye Birdie, the editing completed, the studio happy, the director, Mr. George Sidney, decided he wanted to shoot more film for a new beginning and end with just me. The studio thought he was nuts, but Mr. Sidney felt so strongly about his instinct and vision that he put up his own money to shoot what became Birdie's signature opening and closing, me on a treadmill, a wind machine blowing in my hair as I sang the title song, Bye Birdie. The studio later reimbursed him. As we prepared for the movie's opening in New York, Mr. Sidney was absolutely convinced that I had a date with destiny. So was my manager. I didn't know what to think, but just in case, I brought along my parents. From the opening, Birdie was a smash. The first week, it grossed more money than any film in Radio City's 30-year history. Although I expected Birdie to do well, I wasn't prepared for all the attention I got. With Birdie a box office smash across the country, I reached what I now realize is a rare and enviable position for any performer. I was, quote, hot. To give you a sense of how much in demand I was in those days, and believe me, I say this with bemusement, not immodesty, President Kennedy issued a request for me to sing at his private birthday party in Manhattan at the Waldorf Hotel. So, at the end of May, I flew to New York. The previous year, Marilyn Monroe had sung Happy Birthday. My performance wouldn't be quite as personal, but I still wanted to live up to the honor of being asked. The party was already underway as I walked into the banquet room. I stared through the lights and found the president's handsome face. Looking directly at him, I delivered a sultry rendition of Baby, Won't You Please Come Home, which seemed to go over quite well, judging by his smile. Afterwards, I accepted an invitation to a private party at an ambassador's elegant East Side brownstone. When I got there, President Kennedy greeted me warmly and asked me to sit beside him. There I was, an electrician's daughter from Sweden in the midst of Camelot. Well, I thought I'd die of nerves. By now, even I have heard all the stories about how much President Kennedy liked to have women around, but I can tell you he was nothing but correct to me, and very charming. He smiled as we were introduced. "This is a long way from Bolshevin," he said. The president revealed a surprising knowledge about my background. Clearly, he'd been briefed. In the middle of our conversation, I spotted his brother Robert across the room. He motioned Robert over, and we shook hands. Then the president asked if I'd sing another song. I said, "How about Bye Bye Blackbird?" He said, "Good." I flashed a sneaky smile and said, "But only if everybody sings along." The president laughed. He said, "If you put it that way, we'll try to do our best." Soon after, I excused myself from the festivities, which were still going strong. Although I was terribly upset about leaving a party where the President of the United States was the honored guest, I had an early plane back to L.A. and I didn't want to miss it. I was the same good girl inside. I had a job to do in L.A. and nothing would deter me. Except for a piano, the MGM soundstage where Elvis and I met was empty. In the background, a few of his guys hung around observing their boss, a ritual I would soon come to expect. Under the watchful gaze of director George Sidney, a studio photographer snapped shots of what the film company executives figured would be an historic moment. Elvis Presley, I'd like you to meet a wonderful young lady, Ann-Margret, said George Sidney. Ann-Margret, this is Elvis Presley. The significance was lost on both Elvis and myself. I reached out my hand and he shook it gently. I've heard a lot about you, he said at the same time, which made us laugh and broke the ice. It also allowed me to catch a glimpse of Elvis's famous smile set off to the left, slightly crooked, very warm and nice. In a few months, the posters advertising Viva Las Vegas would tout us as that go-go guy and that bye-bye gal. But that day, we looked rather straight-laced. Elvis wore a suit and tie, and I must say, he looked great. We were both very conservative, very correct. Little did we know that we both shared a devil within. We left with a good sense of one another. I realized that Elvis was as shy and ill at ease meeting new people as I was. Later, he told me that he too thought that he detected a kindred soul in me, a smile, a glance. He sensed something was there, some kind of chemistry. We both felt a current, an electricity that went straight through us. It would become a force we couldn't control. Over the years, many people have written about what they think happened next between Elvis and myself, but until now, I've never addressed those special, treasured, intimate moments. But there's just no getting around it. Our relationship was too big a part of my life to ignore. He had touched something deep within my psyche. Somehow, Elvis has been distorted into the sort of figure that he feared, more myth than man. But the Elvis Aaron Presley that I knew was very much a young man at the peak of his creative powers and enjoying life to the fullest. He was happy and fun. He was also loving and good. The thing that caused him his biggest problems was the enormous fame that engulfed him. Because at heart, Elvis was no saint or king, but rather a kid. From day one, when we gathered around the piano to run through the film's songs, Elvis and I knew that it was going to be serious between us. That day we discovered two things about each other. Once the music started, neither of us could stand still. Also, we experienced music in the same visceral way. We looked at each other move and saw virtual mirror images. When Elvis thrust his pelvis, mine slammed forward too. When his shoulder dropped, I was down there with him. When he whirled, I was already on my heel. I was amazed. "It's uncanny," I said. And he grinned. Whatever it was, Elvis liked it, and so did I. It was like discovering a long-lost relative, a soulmate. Not long after shooting began, Elvis asked me out. "Rusty, how about going out with me and the guys to see a show?" I couldn't wait. We slipped out late at night, a whole group of us. It was an innocent, friendly date. How could it have been anything else? We weren't alone for 1 second. In time, that would change. I was used to having my parents accompany me on dates, so Elvis's group wasn't a problem, and his guys always treated me great. As time went on, Elvis grew more and more comfortable around me and most trusting, which was very rare with him. Usually Elvis was surrounded by his guys, but I sometimes noticed that soon after I came over, everyone would suddenly leave, just disappear, and we'd be alone. The more time Elvis and I spent together, the more we learned how eerily similar we were. Some things were obvious, such as a love of motorcycles, music, performing. We'd both also experienced meteoric rises in show business. We liked our privacy. We loved our families. We had a strong belief in God. We both found solace in the quiet of the night. While the rest of the world slept, we talked until 3 or 4 in the morning. Early in the relationship, Elvis asked Esposito what it was about me that he couldn't get out of his head. And Joe said, "She's the female you." Oh, dear. On the set, Elvis and I always had ideas, and we worked with a sixth sense. One day we were in my dressing room with choreographer David Winters, who wanted to talk about working out moves to the song Cheek to Cheek. He put on the tape. We listened to it once, watching each other from across the room, staring into each other's eyes and thinking. We didn't say a word. We didn't have to. The moment the music started again, Elvis and I just started to move. Nothing had been rehearsed. We covered the entire room, bumping into furniture, shoving it aside, circling each other like a couple of caged animals. In that spontaneous burst of creativity, we choreographed almost all the moves. Afterward, we looked at David, and he said, "Great, just do that." We weren't much tamer off the set. By the time the production returned to L.A. from Las Vegas, our relationship was the best-kept secret in town. The columnists loved us. But my parents were the only ones to whom I opened up and confessed Elvis's and my closeness. As soon as Viva Las Vegas began shooting in L.A., Elvis became a regular visitor to our apartment. After I bought my parents a house in the hills, Elvis came there too. At first, Elvis didn't believe that I really rode motorcycles, but once he saw me maneuver my bike, he was impressed. On the picture, I did most of my own stunts, and he usually watched from the background. Both of us shared the same passion for Harleys, the sound, speed, the thrill of pushing 100 on a straightaway and feeling the immense power. Whatever it was that made me so uninhibited, so defiant of danger, Elvis shared it. We were indeed soulmates, shy on the outside, but unbridled within. We both lived on the edge, and we were both self-destructive in our own ways. Years later, I would struggle to save myself. I only wish that I could have saved Elvis. But at that moment, we thought nothing could go wrong. His wish was that we could stay together, but of course, we both knew that that was impossible, and that's what was so very difficult about our relationship. Elvis and I knew that he had commitments, promises to keep, and he vowed to keep his word. Both of us knew that no matter how deeply we felt about each other, no matter how strong our bond, we weren't going to last. We tried not to think about it. But sometimes that was impossible. We talked about marriage. We were so alike, so compatible. Perhaps the rest of the world had no problem imagining us married, but that vision was helped along by the fantasy our movie created. Viva Las Vegas concludes with Lucky and Rusty marrying in a lavish ceremony. After that scene, while the movie was still in production, MGM released publicity photos taken at the wedding. Within hours, it seemed that every Hollywood gossip had us engaged. Soon after I returned to Los Angeles from a trip to Europe, everything about the world was suddenly, horrifyingly different. On November 22nd, I drove into Beverly Hills to shop. I parked my car, but before I got out, I sensed something eerie outside. Then I noticed that the people on the sidewalk all had the same stunned expression. People in cars pulled over. It was as if everything around me was slowing down, stopping. I turned on the radio and heard the horrible news. President Kennedy had been shot in Dallas. I started to cry. Only 6 months earlier, I had sung at the president's birthday party. I had fallen under the magic Kennedy spell. Elvis and I spoke on the phone, and he wanted me to come over. I found him glued to the TV. I sat down next to him, and we stayed like that for what seemed an eternity, watching, waiting, and crying over the president's death. In that horrible time, we were Americans, ordinary concerned citizens who, like everyone else, were devastated at the tragic loss of our generation's finest leader. By late February, Elvis began to work on the next in the series of movies that he would grow to detest for their predictability and shallowness. In later years, we'd sometimes commiserate, because from the time we made Viva, I'd always told him what a fine dramatic actor he could be. Elvis just looked down. He thought so too, but realized that forces he couldn't control kept him from growing. By that time, our relationship had, by necessity rather than choice, shifted gears. There were other factors in Elvis's life that forced him apart from me, and I understood them. Elvis had always been honest with me, but still, it was a very confusing situation. We continued to see each other periodically. Then everything halted. We knew the relationship had to end, that Elvis had to fulfill his commitment. I now began putting all my energies into my career. The next picture turned out to be Kitten with a Whip, an interesting, ambitious attempt at film noir that was doomed by its exploitative-sounding title. Discarding the wholesome image I earned in Birdie and Viva Las Vegas, I played a renegade, schizophrenic, reform school escapee, a girl billed in the ad campaign for the picture as frightening and unpredictable. Kitten did well at the box office despite some atrocious reviews. It also sorely tarnished my reputation with fans. The same problem frustrated Elvis. People did not want us to change. Still, there was a payoff. Vincent Canby, the New York Times movie critic, praised my acting in Kitten, and director Mike Nichols saw the movie, and years later, remembering that he had liked me, gave me a screen test and cast me in Carnal Knowledge. I did 2 movies in a row, and then I started another film called Once a Thief, which kept me in San Francisco. As the filming wound up, I decided to see a movie with a couple of friends. We arranged to meet in my hotel lobby, and I still remember that moment with vivid clarity. I wore boots and an olive green 3/4 coat, very glamorous, with a fluffy collar. As I stood there, 2 young men came over to say hello. I had briefly met Alan Carr before in Hollywood, and I had also been introduced to the other guy, Roger Smith, that morning at O'Hare Airport in Chicago 3 years before. Nice guy, no sparks, but, as they say, that was then. Roger explained that he was in town doing a nightclub act. We talked until my friends came. He said, "How about coming by tonight?" And I said, "Oh, that's so nice, thank you, but I can't. I'm already going to a movie." And Roger said, "Well, how about after the movie? I don't go on until pretty late." And I apologized. "I wish I could, but I've got to go to bed. I'm working tomorrow, early call. It's the last day, then everybody goes home." Just as we'd done 4 years earlier, Roger and I said goodbye and didn't expect to see each other again, except perhaps in passing. But this time, something clicked for me. I loved Roger's smile, his dimples, and the way he looked at me. In order to complete the last sequence of shots, we needed the weather to be foggy, traditional Bay Area pea soup. But we awoke to sunshine, and hence, filming was postponed. The same thing happened day after day. Then one morning my phone rang. "You still here?" the caller asked. "Roger, isn't this amazing?" Secretly, I had hoped this would happen. "Why don't you come down and see my show, as long as you're here?" I waited a couple days before I let Roger know that I'd see him. As usual, I took along a couple of chaperones, the assistant director and a sound man. And the 3 of us entered the club a few minutes after Roger had started. The bill included comedians Don Adams and Bill Cosby. Roger played his guitar, sang, and told some jokes. At 6'2", he was very good-looking with hazel eyes. He was also funny, quick with a line, and extremely charming. I also sensed a deep inner strength and confidence as I watched him perform. The following night, Roger, Ellen, and I went to an Italian place, and it was fun and enticing and unnerving in that I knew I was captivated by this handsome new man in my life. The more I talked to Roger, the more I wanted to know about him. I was also fascinated by Ellen. While Roger was a thoughtful, serious man of few words, his manager, Alan, was the life of the party. He knew so much about show business and could hardly contain all he knew. They complemented each other perfectly. Not until we knew each other much better did Roger tell me that he had been married and was a father. But that was fine. Roger had clearly traveled an interesting road, and I saw that he was sure of himself, much more able to take control of his career than I was of mine. After making several movies with Universal and Columbia, Roger's big break came when he signed a contract with Warner Brothers' TV department and was cast as Jeff Spencer, a hip detective in the new series 77 Sunset Strip. Between 1958 and 1964, every teen in America, and plenty of adults too, snapped their fingers to the show's opening theme and sat riveted. Now that I've seen the reruns, I can see why every woman in America was infatuated with this interesting man who was just entering my life. The rest of the evening went fine. Roger noted with happiness that the weatherman was predicting clear, sunny skies for an indeterminate amount of time. Roger phoned later. He mustered up his courage and asked me out, with just him. I said I couldn't wait. We drove to San Jose and parked at the small airport, which piqued my curiosity. Then we walked onto the tarmac where the planes were parked. I followed Roger and looked for our pilot. As we stepped up to a white plane, Roger opened the door and motioned for me to get in. I put one foot up, then hesitated, and said, "Who's going to fly this thing?" "I am," he said. Maybe that was it. Maybe that was the moment I fell in love, I don't know. But I looked at Roger and saw the kind of man I dreamed of finding. He made me feel incredibly safe and secure. We spent the late afternoon flying over San Francisco. The sun painted the ground below luminescent hues of gold, green, and blue. Roger showed me the redwoods to the north. He zipped by the Golden Gate Bridge. I glanced at Roger, watched him fly, steering us through the sky, through an occasional cloud, and then sweeping across the bay and down along the coastline. And I felt a closeness that I knew would only grow stronger. Fortunately for us, the last day of shooting was delayed by good weather for the next 2 weeks. Roger and I saw each other every day and night. It's hard to believe that there was anything in the world left to talk about, but we talked till dawn. Well, finally, these romantic 2 weeks ended. We finished shooting the picture. Roger drove me to the airport that night. Neither of us talked much in the car. Although we'd promised to get together in L.A., Roger thought our relationship was finished. He'd read about me in movie magazines and figured that my life in Hollywood was too much for him to compete with. It was a tough goodbye. I sat on the plane, fighting back my own tears and pondering my feelings. Roger seemed to be the man I was sure I was looking for. Smart, strong, tender, handsome. He was so confident, and it was just so unbelievably reassuring to me. Roger was so much like my father in that regard. As a child, I viewed men who were strong, positive about their beliefs, and had the last word. My father, my uncles, my grandfathers, all the Swedish men. Roger fulfilled that myth. Furthermore, as an actor, Roger did not need to ask about what I did. He understood the occupation. I felt that if we grew old and gray together, we would still have things to discuss, that we would still be passionate about each other. At that moment, Roger seemed perfect to me. But there were some problems. Roger told me that he was separated from his wife and was trying to get a divorce. Their marriage had come undone while he was doing 77 Census Strip. Furthermore, to really complicate matters, there were 3 children, Tracy, 7, Jordan, 6, and Dallas, 3. How would I feel about his children and they about me? Would I see Roger again, or was it all over? I had no answers that day, only happiness and a lot of tears. As I went into pre-production on The Cincinnati Kid, I did a lot of soul-searching. Prior to San Francisco, I'd been involved with several different men, but suddenly I found myself thinking of just one. When Roger phoned, I felt like I was talking to my closest friend after a long separation. It was a wonderful period for me. I was in love and also doing a film I liked. It was such a great time to be at MGM. In the morning, I'd go to makeup and wonder which great actress I'd see in the chair beside me. However, the biggest draw was master hairstylist Mr. Sidney Gilleroff. Oh, it was indeed a golden era, a stimulating, inspiring place to be. Steve McQueen, my Cincinnati Kid co-star, was a real tough guy, full of machismo, a man who made his own rules, but both of us got along really well. He was a truly gifted actor. We found common ground, our love of speed, cars, and especially motorcycles. Then I got into hot water with the studio. My manager relayed stern orders from executives that I had to quit riding my motorcycle to work. They didn't want me doing anything risky that might cause an injury and delay the film. I objected, of course. After all, I didn't drink, smoke, or do any of the things that other actors did to relieve stress. I like to unwind by riding my motorcycle, I argued. Steve was the only one who took my side. He'd gone through the exact same thing. So I asked him, "What did you do?" "I kept riding the bike." "Well, what about the studio?" "Oh, let them worry about it. That's what they do so well." "Well, then what do you think I should do?" He said, "Keep riding the bike." Roger and I were oddballs. Both of us craved privacy. Comedian Don Rickles, who used to live in my apartment building, reacted with such surprise whenever we bumped into each other in the lobby. "There she is! The monk is out!" Within a few months of being together, Roger and I slipped into our own reclusive world. Roger had given his house in L.A. to his ex-wife and children, and his apartment was just a way station, he felt. So we were hermits at my house, a very feminine abode. The living room was Kelly green, lit by dark pink light bulbs. I remember showing him the bedroom. Roger stood in the doorway and looked at the color of the walls. He said, "That's quite a color." I smiled and said, "Hot pink. Very hot. And that bed, I don't think I've ever seen a round bed." Elvis had given me that bed, I will now admit, and it was very special to me. "I got it from a friend," I said. Eventually, the truth came out. I told Roger a little, very little, about my relationship with Elvis. Roger didn't mind, because Roger was and is completely secure, another trait I liked. Then there were the truly big nights. On January 18th, 1965, I served as one of the Masters of Ceremonies at President Lyndon Johnson's inaugural ball. I shared the honors with Johnny Carson, Julie Andrews, Carol Channing, and Alfred Hitchcock. After the inaugural, I traveled to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where Roger was doing his nightclub routine. I arrived in the middle of a snowstorm, which never let up the entire week. Well, I couldn't have asked for better weather. Nothing to do and nowhere to go, just be with Roger. We acted like two little kids, and yet we were so serious. There were a few obstacles, things that were more comfortable left unspoken. Actually, there were two. One was my career. Privately, Roger and Alan criticized my career as being completely mismanaged. The other obstacle was Roger's separation. He still was not divorced. I didn't ask too many questions. It was none of my business until he wanted to make it my business. But my parents did not look at it that way. I was their business, and they were not exactly thrilled at Roger's credentials as an actor of dubious employment. Then there was the problem of 3 children. He wasn't, at least then, my parents' idea of Prince Charming. Roger tried to improve matters by going to Mexico for a quickie divorce. His heart was in the right place, but that still did not matter to my parents. They were a tough audience. I saw them nearly every day. They barely mentioned his name. They barely acknowledged he was part of my life. In our house, we repressed our anger, held it in, and reacted with a simmering silence. However, the more the subject was avoided, the more pronounced it became. Roger didn't have to be a topic of discussion to be on our minds. My parents wanted only happiness for me, and I wanted nothing except to please them. Oh boy, it made for an unpleasant, tense time. Roger saw it clearly. I was in love with him, but I also loved my parents. I wanted both, and it created great conflict. When I decided to continue going with Roger, it was really the first time in my life that I had angered my parents. It was the toughest thing I'd ever done. It made me crazy. More and Furthermore, I relied on Roger's willingness to take charge, his strength and instinct. We secretly moved into my house together. We vacationed together. Even the press realized it was serious. My parents still remained silent. As Roger and I spent more time together, it became increasingly difficult, almost absurd, that he stay out of my business affairs. And Roger got bolder in speaking his mind. He asked if I knew about the numerous deals being made for me. He asked if I realized how many movies I was committed to. He asked if I knew what was happening with the large sums of money I earned. The answer was no. I never questioned people. My mom, who was already wary of Roger, viewed his inquiries with skepticism. Like me, she still gave my manager the benefit of the doubt, reasoning that he'd done okay so far. Daddy, though, relied on his gut feelings and said that he thought Roger made sense. Roger and I actually grew closer. Finally, Roger felt secure enough to introduce me to his 3 children. When I got my first look at them, they were lined up outside my house as straight as the Von Trapp children in The Sound of Music. Tracy was 7, Jordan 6, and Dallas 3. Later, when I told Roger how adorable I thought the kids were, he breathed a sigh of relief. And I began to feel as if I were part of a new and very special family. I'd given thought to our marrying, but with my parents' feelings about Roger, our relationship was not without its difficulties. Roger was as aware of my tug-of-war as anyone. But he was old-fashioned, impetuous, and a hardcore romantic. Aware that we weren't going to rush into any wedding plans, he explained that he still thought it would be nice to pledge his love in some way. He gave me a beautiful diamond ring, immaculate and breathtaking. Since it would have been impossible to hide the sizable ring on my finger, I broke the news to my parents. I would have liked them to have been as happy as I was, but knew that they would be just the opposite. They were as cool as a Swedish winter. We argued. Mother and I cried. But I knew I was right. Even if I couldn't explain it to my parents, I knew in my heart that Roger was the man that I was destined to wed. I quietly enjoyed my ring and my new status as an engaged woman on the set of Murderers Row, my next movie starring Dean Martin. Just as Murderers Row wound down, my manager, Bobby, asked me to meet him to discuss the future. Naively, I thought that maybe he was upset at the downward spiral that my career had taken and wanted to talk about parting ways. For the first time in 5 years, I did not have another picture lined up after this one finished. Well, I couldn't have been more wrong about his plans. He said, "Listen, Ann-Margret, I've done a lot for you in the last 5 years. Considering everything, I don't think I'm out of line in saying that I need an increase." I said, "What?" I was confused and suddenly wishing Roger or Alan were with me. He said, "A raise. I've been getting 15%. I'd like 25. Now, I knew nothing about business, but 25%? That sounded high to me. Very shaken, I managed an uncertain smile and said that I had to think about it. I made record time to my parents' house and poured everything out. Then a friend of our family, an attorney, someone we trusted implicitly, persuaded me to let him look over my books. He informed me that I was several $100,000 in debt. I slid down in my chair, wishing I could disappear. I was heartbroken, primarily because my innate, trusting nature had served me so poorly. I felt angry with myself, used, and very shaky inside. I met with my business manager and then with Bobby. I asked questions and demanded explanations, while Bobby calmly repudiated any wrongdoing. We parted without resolving anything. The next move, whatever that was mine to take. "Mark my words," he said to a friend of ours. "In 2 years, Ann-Margret will be out of show business." The scary part was how close that was to being true. I was offered no scripts, no prospects. The burst of heat that propelled me into multi-picture deals with every studio in Hollywood was history. And to make matters worse, I was in fairly grim financial straits. One of my business managers was now telephoning Roger and asking if there was any money he didn't know about to pay the bills that were coming in. At the end of 1966, producer Joseph E. Levine got word to Roger that he wanted me for the lead in a film that he was making in Italy. The offer came from nowhere, and it was the lone bright spot save for the ring on my finger. Although the salary was a small percentage of what I was used to earning, I needed the money, and I also needed the work. Roger and Alan acted as a team of unofficial coaches. With my movies, The Swinger and Murderer's Row, opening back-to-back in December, Roger and I flew to Rome. We returned home in March 1967 as I approached my 26th birthday, and I didn't know whether I was finished. It was a very painful time. Meanwhile, Roger and Alan made it clear that they not only were willing to, but wanted to assume management of my career. Although I continually refused, there was no doubt that as one mess led to another, Roger and Alan were the only ones that I trusted in business. One weekend, we flew to Las Vegas and saw my friend Eddie Fisher's show at the Riviera Hotel. I sensed the excitement, the high that Eddie felt, and I knew that I wanted to share that. I told Roger later that night, I said, one of these days, I want to have a show of my own. A nightclub act? He asked. And I said, sure, that's how I started out. Roger didn't even wait. He said, let's do it. Well, I hadn't expected that response, and I quickly withdrew my offer and said, I can't. What do you mean? You're a performer, aren't you? That's what you've done all your life. You're happiest when you're singing, dancing, being on stage, right? So why do you say you can't? Because I'm frightened. That was not the real me talking, the person who could take a motorcycle around the corner at high speeds, and Roger knew it. It seemed as if I'd been the one who always said no. Engagement, wedding, nightclub act. But shortly after we returned from Las Vegas, some inner clock told me the time was right to get married. Instinct, intuition, the same forces that always guided me were again at work. When I told Roger, he looked up surprised. We're going to have to talk about it. I said, what do you mean? I mean, I want to marry you, but I think there are a few things we have to talk about first. He explained that he loved me deeply. He had no hesitation when it came to pledging his love forever, but there was a problem. He did not want to take our relationship to the next step unless I severed my relationship with the people involved with my career, from my manager on down. Everyone who had had anything to do with getting me in the situation that I was struggling to escape. Let Alan and me run things, because I can't be married to you and have that person screwing things up more. And I said, I can't. And he said, even though you know what he's done to you, I can't. Even though Alan and I are already involved, I just can't. You're not going to do anything about it? I can't. I sounded like a broken record. Finally, Roger got angry, and rightly so. I cried. The disagreement quickly escalated into a horrible, horrible argument, the worst in the nearly 3 years we'd been together. We were both proud, and neither of us would back down. Roger stalked out of the house and got into his car to leave. I followed. He spoke one last time. Then we can't get married. My face was wet from tears. Without saying a word, I slipped off the engagement ring, handed it to him, and walked back into the house. Our breakup was chronicled in the next day's edition of the Los Angeles Times. To this day, Roger and I have no idea where or how they got the story, and seeing it in print only made things worse. I was proud and angry, and I made up my mind that I wasn't going to sit home and sulk. I would show Roger I didn't care. I went out with friends, but no matter how hard I tried to distract myself, I could not shake my feelings for Roger, and that just aggravated my misery. After 2 weeks with no contact, Roger sent me a letter. I hesitated before opening the envelope. If Roger had something to tell me, why didn't he just call? Then I read the handwritten note, and I realized that sometimes the heart speaks better on paper. I reread it several times and then had to wipe my eyes. In straightforward prose that read like poetry, Roger simply said that he missed me, he loved me till his heart ached from exertion, and he had been wrong to push me to do something I didn't want to do. As soon as I composed myself, I dialed his number. And I said, "I love you." The letter, it was beautiful. And he said, "I missed you so much. I worried that I wouldn't hear from you again, that you wouldn't call." And I said, "You're right, but I love you so much." He said, "Let's make a date." I said, "I'm free now, tonight, and later on." He said, "No, a date to get married. Let's set a date, and the next time we see each other, it'll be to get married." Agreed. I had always imagined a storybook wedding for myself. A white dress, lots of family. Perhaps the ceremony would be at the little white church in Sweden. Or perhaps it would be just a beautiful garden-style wedding. Never in my wildest dreams did I think that it would be a family catastrophe. May 8th, 1967 should have been the happiest day of my life, but it turned out to be one of the worst. At my parents' house, I stared out the window, waiting for Roger, and determined to exchange vows that day no matter what. But of course that, quote, "no matter what" part bothered me. I was torn between being a good, obedient daughter and an adult and independent woman. As I waited, Daddy brooded in a dark silence, and Mother locked herself in the bedroom. Roger picked me up, drove to the airport, and flew us to Las Vegas in his plane. Soaring through the cloudless sky was the highlight of the day. The world and all its troubles were far below. Roger had arranged for a suite at the Riviera, and the management was very happy to help since I had agreed to do a nightclub act there, and it would be good publicity. Except we wanted everything to be kept quiet. After landing, we took care of the papers at City Hall, where several reporters routinely hung out. We hurried to the hotel before word spread too far, but as we pulled in front of the Riviera, we saw a giant banner. It said, "Welcome, Ann-Margret and Roger." We went directly to our room, traveling in my wedding outfit, a white piqué micro miniskirt and matching piqué fluffy short shorts. After all, this was the 60s. I went to apply my makeup and lipstick, but my hand trembled so violently from nerves I could barely do it. My face was puffy, and my eyes swollen from crying so hard. As I struggled, there was a knock on the door, and I heard a stranger's voice. Could you please hurry?" And I said, "Is something wrong?" "Well, the minister has another wedding to do right after yours." When I walked into the adjoining suite where the ceremony was to take place, I was engulfed by smoke. Looking through the gray cloud, I saw the room was completely full. A throng of reporters and photographers in their short sleeves stood around talking and smoking. Why not? It was just another workday for them. Oh, but not for me. I had always vowed that I'd have just one wedding in my life. This was not the church wedding I'd envisioned, in Sweden with friends and relatives, but for better or worse, this was it. Yet I could barely see my soon-to-be husband through the crowd. I felt tears coming. The poor minister. He was such a nice man. He had no idea what hit him. As he readied the service, I started to cry. And then, a few moments later, I really lost control. The minister stopped, picked up a napkin from a buffet table that had been set up, and handed it to me. By the time the short ceremony ended, my makeup was completely smeared. Then the newsmen surrounded me. We left the food, cake, and whatever else had been arranged to the crowd in the room and flew back to L.A. We spent our wedding night at our house, and for a moment, I felt that our relationship would return to normal. However, the next night I freaked out, and I left Roger. We had spent about 15 hours as a married couple. Then I moved back in with my parents in a fit of confusion and panic. I suppose I was acting out the conflicted emotions I simply could not resolve, whether to be a grown-up or a child, a wife or a daughter. With me, nothing was simple. I spent the daytime with Roger, but then disappeared around dinner and went back to my parents. I wanted to apologize in some way, my mother in particular, for hurting them by going through with the wedding, and also to show them that even though I'd married Roger, I was still their little girl. For a while, my mom quietly watched this. Privately, she was appalled. Roger was now my husband, and it was, she felt, my duty to be with him. Then one day Roger phoned my mother. They talked about the situation for a while, and that call became the bridge over troubled water. Finally, Mother and Roger had something in common. Both of them were completely bewildered by my behavior and unsure of what to do. This forced them to talk to each other. They took preliminary steps towards becoming the close friends they are today. One night, I sat down with Mom and had the sort of long talk we used to have when I was a little girl. I told her my basic problem. I feared that marriage would pull me away from Daddy and her. She responded, "I think that being married isn't always easy, and I think that you should pack your belongings and go home to your husband." And the next morning I did just that. I had received the parental blessing that I craved. I was released from my childhood and ready to be a married woman. Roger and I stayed together that night and every night since then. Whatever inhibitions I had felt about doing a nightclub act also lessened. For my opening night at the Riviera Hotel, June 7th, 1967, friends and fans turned out in full force. George Burns gave me a good luck kiss backstage. Elvis sent a huge bouquet of flowers shaped like a guitar, something he'd do every opening night from then on. I always felt a wonderful warm glow when I saw them. Andy Williams, Virginia Mayo, Frankie Avalon, Lauren Green, Gene Barry, Rona Barrett, Clint Walker, Jim Bacon, and Miss Betty Grable filled the ringside tables. I remember my mother came to my side moments before the curtain went up. "Ann-Margret, tre sparkar." It was a reminder. I turned around and she gave me my 3 Swedish good luck kicks. I was ready. Now there was no subtlety to my arrival on stage. Amid a shower of psychedelic lights, I rode to the center of the stage on a Harley, flanked on each side by 6 dancers who were also on bikes. It was a production that did not let up for 90 minutes. Afterwards, a crowd that included Johnny Carson gathered in the dressing room to celebrate. It reminded me of what I already knew, that there is no substitute for performing in front of a live audience. The feeling of triumph was a welcome boost to my bruised ego. I was overwhelmed by the reviews, which Roger and Alan read to me out loud. Toward the end of the 5-week engagement, I received another compliment. Elvis, his father, and a couple of the guys came to see the show. Knowing the hassles that he went through going out in public, I was really touched. Afterwards, they came to the dressing room. At one point, I was by myself in front of the makeup mirror when Elvis walked inside. I turned and smiled. Our eyes met, and suddenly, the old connection burned as brightly as it had years earlier. Elvis complimented me on the show, and coming from him, it meant the world. I started to thank him, but Elvis interrupted. "It should be the other way around," he said. His smile faded, and his eyes lost their playfulness and turned serious. All of a sudden, he wanted to remember the times we'd shared and how happy we'd been and how happy he had been. Elvis then stepped forward and dropped to one knee. He took my hands in his. I felt the heat in both of our bodies, and in a soft, gentle voice weighted by seriousness, he told me exactly how he still felt about me, which I intuitively knew, but was very touched to hear. When the engagement was up and we returned to Los Angeles, we faced the same frustration as before. The networks were not interested in a TV special, and the studios were not sending any scripts. Roger and Alan made a strong appeal to take over management of my career. By then, Roger knew that he had lost the desire to perform and was willing to devote himself to me and my career. He and Alan argued that nothing was working. I knew they were right, but I could not make that decision. I didn't have the guts to break with my manager. I did not have the self-worth. Roger and I sat down to dinner one night, and he poured himself a glass of wine. He knew better than to offer me one. I'd always refused, claiming that I just didn't like the taste of alcohol. But a glass of wine back then was a symbol of sophistication, something that enhanced the enjoyment of a meal, and being a gourmet, he wanted me to share that pleasure. He had no idea of my father's history with alcoholism. I had felt that this was a private matter between Daddy and me, nor was I aware of the genetic disposition of the disease. Then Roger brought a bottle of Boone's Farm Apple Valley wine. He said, "You might want to try a glass of this. It tastes like punch. You'll like it." So I let Roger pour me some wine in a glass full of ice. He was right. I beamed. "This tastes great." Well, the first glass went straight to my head. I felt a wonderful warm feeling going all through my body. I relaxed. And midway through the second glass, I was happy, carefree, cracking jokes, and brimming with confidence. I was certainly not myself. In fact, I was surely more fun than myself. Or so I thought. Little did I realize that the wine set off a chemical reaction in my brain. Then I had wine with several other dinners. Within a couple of weeks, I was drinking scotch and had progressed from a teetotaler to 80 proof. The warning signs were all there. I didn't recognize them, and Roger had no reason to. It was during this period that my career began to improve. Although I still had no offers in the U.S., The Tiger and the Pussycat was a big hit in Europe. The picture's producer, Joseph E. Levine, signed me to 2 more movies. And as soon as the scripts were ready, Roger and I flew to Italy to work on The Prophet. For the first time, I was outside the mainstream. Although the Italians themselves were a delight, I just love them, the working conditions were different from Hollywood productions. The budget was tight, the schedule taxing. Then after Christmas, we traveled to Argentina to shoot the romantic thriller Criminal Affair. As far as filmmaking went, it was very difficult. Schedules changed every day, as did equipment. The production company operated on such a shoestring that there weren't even any dressing rooms. If I was unhappy, Roger was miserable during the shoot. He did not mince words either. He said, "Everyone wanted you. You could have done 1 big movie a year, but that manager of yours kept selling you into pictures with no script approval. And now look at us, no dressing room and sharing a bathroom with strangers." After a month, we flew to Beirut, the location of the second of the 2 films, Rebus. As we confronted endless script changes, equipment breakdowns and delays, the movie was a trial. I gave the very best that I could in Beirut, but I worked in a state of numbness. In the midst of the production, I became incredibly disgusted. I was furious that I had allowed myself to have been taken advantage of to such a degree. I was overweight, I drank too much. Both were symptoms of how badly I wanted to blot out the anger and the hurt. I walked, talked, sang, danced, acted. I did whatever I had to. The only thing I couldn't do was express myself to Roger. I was silent and morose. Finally, after one dismal workday, I got so angry that the depth of my emotion scared me. I was so upset that I knew something had to give, or else I would destroy myself. I couldn't sleep that night. I watched the sun rise over Beirut, and I waited for Roger to wake up. "Please, you take over," I said to him that morning, okay? "Ann-Margret, what do you mean?" "Everything. You and Alan, just take over. Make things better. Will you?" He said, "Yes, I will." Roger and Alan worked out the details of extricating me from my old management contract. Then, within a month of taking over, Roger and Alan did the impossible. They had heard that Canada Dry was interested in sponsoring a television variety special. And realizing that my act from the Riviera could easily be adapted, Canada Dry bought the show. Although this helped me get out of debt, money was not as important as self-esteem. The special gave us the opportunity we wanted, to repackage me to the public and erase the perception that I was nothing but a tarnished actress. Once we had firmed up the deal, Roger and Alan knew what to do. We put together a new album with Lee Hazelwood called The Cowboy and the Lady, and that, plus news of my Canada Dry deal, got me mentioned in the columns and the opportunity to go on some talk shows. You could see Alan's philosophy at work. Activity breeds activity. In the spirit of starting over, Roger and I shopped for a new house. And in November, we found our dream home, a beautiful white Cape Cod-style house on a 10-acre spread in one of the canyons. Hedgerow, as it was called, had once been owned by Hedy Lamarr and Jean Rowland. We worried, needlessly as it turned out, about how my special would fare when it aired on December 1st, 1968. This hour-long razzle-dazzle of song and dance spotlighted all the different sides of my personality. I opened riding a motorcycle along the beach singing Big Time, and included comedy sketches with Bob Hope, Jack Benny, Danny Thomas, and Carol Burnett. The next day, the critics who had run me out of town showed a reversal of opinion. Afterwards, I stepped straight into a more serious role, rehearsing with Bob Hope for his annual Christmas show in Vietnam. In size and scope, this was completely unlike my first trip to Southeast Asia. The production was mammoth. We had elaborate security. We opened in Saigon before an audience of 20,000. We might have been shielded from the bullets, but not their effect. I walked through combat hospitals and visited with the wounded soldiers, smiling and thanking the guys lying in bed. I remember asking about some soldiers that I had met the previous day and finding out that they had been killed in combat hours after we had shaken hands. It was an emotionally numbing experience. I held on tightly to Roger. After returning home, thinking about what those brave men and women endured, I have a pain in my heart to this day, and I always will. Roger took care of every detail of our lives, shielding me from everything that did not include performing. He answered calls, dealt with agents, read the scripts, and oversaw the shows. My second TV special featured both Dean Martin and Lucille Ball as guests. I had been a big admirer of Dean's and Lucy's for years. Lucy was, as expected, funny, warm, helpful, and just plain fun. We did a song and dance number called Autograph Annie and Celebrity Lou, a parody of Autograph Hounds. Afterwards, we had to go into the recording studio and dub the vocals. Lucy was scheduled first. We wanted to be as respectful of her time as possible. She didn't need long, just a few takes. We thanked her and said she didn't have to stick around any longer, but she sat down and lit a cigarette. She said, "Oh, I'm not going anywhere. I'm just going to sit here and wait and see how long it takes for Junior to do this." Then Lucy flashed me a big grin, a friendly challenge. I remember I did my part, and luckily, I nailed it in just one take. She said, "Hey, the kid's all right." The special, which aired December 6th, 1969, scored well in the ratings and earned really nice reviews. It also generated a certain buzz. Then my agent heard that Stanley Kramer, who had directed classics like On the Beach, Judgment at Nuremberg, and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, was about to begin a picture called RPM with Anthony Quinn. Once Mr. Kramer heard me read, he gave me the part, which turned out to be a mixed blessing. My role called for partial nudity, which by 1970 was hardly unusual. But given my strict upbringing, it was a very big deal. Every night after work, I promptly took the edge off my nerves with alcohol. For me, there was a subtle psychological change underway. Whereas at first I had liked the confidence alcohol had given me, now I began to anticipate my drink with dinner as if it were medicine. 18 days after RPM wrapped, I began work on another feature called C.C. and Company. The movie had been Alan's idea, and Roger wrote the script. Furthermore, Roger and Alan's newly formed company, Rogallen, was producing. They had created this film as a vehicle for me. When C.C. and Company finished, Roger and I returned to our home. I had worked too hard and drunk too much. I had begun using alcohol as a crutch to numb the tingling I felt inside. Did it have a noticeable effect on my behavior? Not yet, but it would very soon. I managed a brief respite before my agent, Sue Mengers, announced that she had another project waiting. She wanted to put me in a Western cast with lots of big-name actors. Roger admired the script and liked the actors who had already committed, but his instinct told him not to accept. Sue thought that he was making a big mistake. She warned him not to wait too long and urged him to be practical. She said, "Look, Mike Nichols isn't exactly calling with an offer." That admonition was a blessing in disguise. A week later, to the day, Mike Nichols called Sue with an offer. Well, more like half an offer, but it turned out to be the break that we had hoped for. Carnal Knowledge chronicled the romantic intimacies of two men as they matured from college through adulthood. It was a brutal, tragic dissection of sexual attitudes and relationships. Written by Jules Pfeiffer, with Mike Nichols directing, it was an actor's dream, and 3 of the 4 parts had already been cast: Jack Nicholson, Candice Bergen, and Art Garfunkel. Mike had been stymied in his search for an actress to play Bobby Templeton, a sex spot betrayed by her sensuality and her men. He had already considered many actresses. Then Kathleen Tynan, the wife of theater critic Kenneth Tynan, suggested me to Mike. Mike called Sue and sent her a script with one condition. He wasn't going to send me a ticket to New York to audition, but if I happened to be there, he'd be very interested in meeting with me. Roger booked a flight immediately. The script for Carnal Knowledge was one of the best that I'd ever read. Terrifying because of what giving life to Bobby would require. I am not a technical actress. I'm all raw emotion and nerves. I literally become the person I'm playing. Bobby Templeton was a case. Roger and I stayed in New York a week, and for the test, I performed one scene 3 times. Mike asked me to give Bobby's character several twists. The test was long, challenging, taxing, and stimulating, and when I finished, I was thoroughly exhausted. Mike complimented my work, which I took as an encouraging sign. I was in my dressing room when there was a knock at the door. Mike entered with something to discuss. He told me he realized how hypersensitive I was, how frail I could be, how exposed and fragile I was compared to most people. He also knew the depth to which I'd have to reach into my soul in order to play Bobby. I'd have to expose myself emotionally and physically, and he wondered how far I was willing to go. Ann-Margret, you've read the script. Obviously, nudity is integral to playing Bobby. Will you be able to do that? If I get the part, yes, I answered. We shared a cab back to my hotel, where he wished me luck as I got out. 3 days later, I was in the suite when there was a knock at the door. A delivery man handed me a dazzling bouquet of flowers and a bottle of chilled champagne. I opened the card and read, "Jules loves you. I love you. You have a job, Mike Nichols." My scream filled the room. Oh. After we returned home, I anticipated a restful couple of months before carnal knowledge began. However, I couldn't rest. I signed a lucrative contract to do 8 weeks at the International Hotel in Vegas. It was scheduled to open right after carnal finished. I also had another TV special to think about. For the first time since I'd taken my first sip of wine, my drinking became a topic of discussion between Roger and me. He expressed some concern, which I ignored. I drank more often than before, chasing after that feeling of confidence and relief that alcohol had originally given me. Yet now I felt only melancholy and angst, and nothing was more frustrating. The more I craved the comfort, warmth, and security I'd once been able to get with a drink or two, the more unattainable that feeling became, and the more irritable I got. I wasn't me. I avoided my parents, who were the foundation of my existence, and the talks Mother and I had on a daily basis dwindled to sporadic conversations. Roger and I argued a lot, something that just did not happen before this stressful period. Arguments would erupt over small things, nothing in particular. Often it was something that was brought on by my drinking. So, at a certain point, I'd bolt out the door, hop on my Harley, and roar down the driveway, even if it was 3 a.m. I'd leave Roger's protests behind, drowned by the deafening roar of my bike. I'd speed along Mulholland Drive, going as fast as I could, exhilarated by the wind in my face and the sheer speed. I often roared off with a good quantity of alcohol in my bloodstream, and I'm sure I must have been affected by it, though I can't honestly say that I ever felt drunk or confused on the road. Roger waited at home, terrified that I would crash. Such was my state of mind when work began on Carnal Knowledge in late November 1970. During the 3 weeks of rehearsal in Vancouver, we all sat around a table and experimented with the scenes, reading them one way, then another. At the end of rehearsals, I knew that I was Bobby. By the time shooting began, I had crossed the psychological line that separated fantasy from reality. I became Bobby, this pitiful woman, this doormat for abuse, who'd spent her life attracted to the wrong kind of man. My life assumed an eerie parallel to the movie. I had capitulated to the character. I spent hours at night pacing in the bathroom, depressed, teetering on the brink of a breakdown, and hoping that I made it through the movie. The others realized my sensitivity and paid special attention. I remember doing a scene in which Bobby can't stop crying. For some reason, I couldn't force myself to cry. I just could not connect. Then abruptly, Jack turned on me. From behind the camera, he became Jonathan, the man Bobby is obsessed with, and he started screaming insults, horrible things about Bobby that caused me to burst into tears instantly. Roger monitored me with the utmost concern. Carnal Knowledge left me in a depressive stupor fueled by pills and alcohol. After the movie wrapped, I had less than a week to switch gears before the most ambitious, grandiose show that I had ever undertaken opened at the International Hotel. I'm surprised that after 3 months of living as Bobby, I could make such a change. Fortunately, I did. In retrospect, I think the challenge of shifting from playing Bobby to being a nightclub performer once again gave me a temporary respite from my inner demons. As soon as the international engagement finished at the end of March, my body just gave out. The strain of shifting from movie to nightclub act finally took its toll. I collapsed with a virus and had to be hospitalized. It was the first time in months that I had thought of anything but work, and I got scared. During May and June, we tackled my next TV special. Then on June 28th, 1971, Carnal Knowledge opened, and I was, quote, hot again. The movie, which was banned in Georgia, sold out in New York, and it was hailed in Hollywood, and it generated an extraordinary amount of debate among filmgoers for its raw, graphic, and unsettling script. My performance, it seemed, generated nearly as much discussion and shock. Even the critics were kind. For me, it was very heady stuff. Yet I tried to react calmly. I fell back on my typical stance, ingrained since childhood. Don't boast, don't enjoy, just keep on working. In truth, though, I was too busy to really focus on this shift in my fortunes. After Carnal Knowledge opened, I performed at the Concord Hotel in upstate New York, then did a small tour of the Playboy resorts. By the time we got back home, I wanted to disappear into my bedroom and sleep for the rest of the season. But Roger begged me to do one last interview. He said, it's with CBS TV, and they want to ask you about making Carnal Knowledge and about working with Mike Nichols. Even as we got off the elevator at CBS's Television City, I was griping. If this wasn't for Mike. And then a moment later, Ralph Edwards, the host of This Is Your Life, introduced himself and said that he was going to interview me. And I thought, what an interesting choice for an interviewer. Then as we walked into the studio, I never once suspected that anything unusual might happen. Then Ralph Edwards came in. I switched my brain to interview mode. His smile was sly, and he said, Ann-Margret? Yes. Then he paused, held out a large book, and declared, Ann-Margret Olsen-Smith, this is your life. Oh, boy. For the next half hour, I struggled to maintain my composure as the people who had been dearest to me were paraded in front of me. My mother, my Uncle Kalle, who'd flown in from Bolshevin, amused at how the show's producers had tracked him down in a sauna, my godparents, one of my best girlfriends from elementary school, my high school music teacher, and director George Sidney. After telling Mr. Edwards that the show represented only part one of my life, Mr. Sidney referred to my career. I don't think it's even started. She's going to go to real great, great heights. Well, I thought, maybe so. But I was also going to go to some real great lows. Roger and I cherished our reclusive lifestyle. We rarely ventured out to restaurants and almost never to Hollywood parties. Hence, few people outside of a trusted group of friends even had a clue of our fights over my drinking. But I wasn't myself, and that changed both of us. Roger was horrified by the effects alcohol had on me. I became frightened and inconsolable at home. I was hurtful to those I loved, including Roger and my mother. Roger begged me to stop drinking. After one binge, I became so sick that Roger rushed me to our doctor's house. He didn't even examine me, just let me sit until my panic dissipated. Then he expressed sincere concern. He said, listen, Ann-Margret, I know this woman. She's a friend of mine. I would like for you to meet her. Why? I asked. For your drinking. Well, I was defiant. I don't want to meet her. I'm happy and healthy. Well, if you change your mind, call me. It was easy for me to fool myself. Although emotionally out of whack, I still functioned normally. I was able to do yet another show at the International. Marvin Hamlish, who had been my rehearsal pianist, took over the music for the show, and both he and Roger wanted me to get more comfortable talking to the audience. One night, as I went from table to table, I spotted some of Elvis's guys. I worked my way back toward a booth, and suddenly I knew exactly who I'd find sitting there. Sure enough, he stood, and the spotlight caught his famous grin. As the audience screamed and clapped, Elvis then improvised a short dance with me. Elvis, however, was not through. As I made my way back to the front, he He somehow got backstage, and he ran on and slid halfway across the stage, stopping right at my feet. The audience went crazy. Another time, Elvis invited us to a party in Vegas. When we arrived, there were about 100 people in his enormous suite. Elvis was entertaining a few people with a sample of his karate moves, and as soon as he spotted me, he got that familiar, mischievous look in his eye. "Hey, Rusty, come over here." Flashing his crooked grin, Elvis explained that he wanted me to stand perfectly still while he threw several karate chops in my direction and showed how close he could come to my face without actually touching or hurting me. A mistake of a mere millimeter could kill me or injure me at the least, but I trusted him implicitly. He said, "Don't move, don't even flinch." "I won't." Elvis stepped back, faced me, bowed slightly, and then with lightning speed reeled off several punches. They happened so fast I couldn't see him, although I did feel a slight breeze touch my face. Afterwards, he shook his head in amazement. "You know, you're crazy." I smiled and said, "So are you." In January, Hollywood's Foreign Press awarded me a Golden Globe for Best Supporting Actress for Carnal Knowledge. Then in February, I received a call that everyone around me said I'd get, but one that I'd never expected. It was Warren Cowan, president of my PR firm. He said, "Are you sitting down?" I said, "Yes." "You got it." I screamed and started to cry. Roger took the receiver. He said, "Congratulations, she got it. Ann-Margret was nominated for an Academy Award for Carnal Knowledge." The joy I felt was very pure. But I had little time to savor all the excitement. I jumped right into The Train Robbers, a traditional Western film starring John Wayne and shot in Durango, Mexico. Despite having had a cancerous lung removed earlier, Duke was still a strong, rugged, formidable man, larger than life. He was a big teddy bear, and he was so wonderful to my parents, and we got along famously. I just found out last year that he had once told a reporter, and I quote, "When I'm dead, at my funeral, I want that little lady to dance on my coffin, because if I don't get up, then you'll know I'm really dead." Unquote. Oh, he was such a great man. At Academy Awards time, April 10th, 1972, we were still filming The Train Robbers in Durango. I wasn't the only actor working on The Train Robbers up for an Oscar. Ben Johnson had also been nominated for his work in The Last Picture Show. Duke put both of us on his private jet and wished us good luck. Of course, I didn't expect to win. I said as much to the army of reporters who shoved microphones at me as Roger, Ellen, and I arrived in a long black limousine, waved to fans, then walked past the spotlights and up the red carpet. Inside, I was sick with nerves. I had additional things to worry about. Not only was I one of the nominees, I also co-presented the Cinematography Award with Screen Actors Guild President John Gavin. He had scripted lines, but when John got to the podium, he picked me up and ad-libbed, "I'd like to thank the Academy for this trophy." When Gene Hackman and Raquel Welch read the names of the nominees for Best Supporting Actress, every second seemed to last an hour. Every muscle in my body tightened as the envelope was opened. And the winner is Cloris Leachman. I squeezed Roger's arm. Sure, I'd wanted to win, but I never expected to win. But all that training in Swedish stoicism helped me through. I felt let down, but okay. The next day, we flew back to the set. Ben had won, and I was just so happy for him. Duke congratulated both of us, and later he took me aside, wrapped his big, strong arms around me, smothering me in his bear-like clasp, and put the whole thing in perspective. Duke looked directly into my eyes. He said, quote, "The hell with those trophies. Little lady, you've got something more special than an award. You've got the ability to make people happy. That tells me you're going to be around a long time. It took me 41 years to get a damn Academy Award. You've got plenty of time, so what do you say we go back and finish making this movie?" The phone call from my mother came while I was in a motel room doing a scene for The Outside Man, a French-American thriller. My father had cancer, and it had already spread. Somehow I finished out the day, then rushed to the hospital to see my father. As I tried to make conversation, I knew I couldn't deal with the reality of his illness. Mother might have been the source of most of the wisdom in my life, but Daddy was my rock, my anchor, the root of my strength. I'd inherited good and bad from him, and even though I was married, I still considered him central to the way I related to the world. He was my father, and I was his little girl. In the days that followed, I vowed not to give up hope, not to let myself think about Daddy not being there. I tried concentrating on work. In private, I felt myself losing control. Roger didn't know what to do with me. I reached a point where my nights blended into one continuous foggy state of inebriation. I'd drink a fifth of scotch, pass out, wake up, drink some more, and pass out again. I also suffered periods that I couldn't remember. In the summer of 1972, I made a trip to promote The Train Robbers. Needless to say, I didn't want to go, preferring to remain in my bedroom. My arm rarely left my husband's side. And at the hotel, I got sick. The next day, I called our doctor, described how I felt, and then stopped in mid-sentence. I quit pretending. And I said, "Remember that friend you once told me about?" And he said, "Yes." "Well, I think I'd like to meet her. Here's her number. You make the call." But I didn't. Not right away. Several days passed. We returned home, and once again I locked myself into the bedroom. I don't remember what made me finally call. Survival, I think. I detested the thought of becoming a victim. And Roger looked on proudly. He never believed that I was going to make that call. He had figured that an accident would have to precipitate it, or something worse. I said, "This is Ann-Margret Smith. We have a mutual doctor friend, and he told me to call you." Everything was a question. She said, "I know. I'd love to meet you." Roger was so grateful to see Kathleen, but he took one look at her, this very proper woman, and said to himself, "There is no way that Ann-Margret's going to listen to her." Kathleen had her own doubts, she confided to me later. She thought, "Now here's this woman who has a beautiful house, a loving husband, and a career that's going better than ever. She's doing just fine. How am I going to tell her that her life is unmanageable?" She walked into the house. She saw our unopened luggage, the disarray. Next, she met me, staring at her with fear. As Kathleen recalls, she looked into my eyes and thought, "They're dead. Her life is unmanageable." The following evening, I went to hear Kathleen speak at a meeting. It was the first time I had been to such a gathering, and I sat in the back, shaking and embarrassed. I wore a black wig and tied a black scarf around my head. I slipped on a pair of dark shades. Everyone was so nice and understanding and sympathetic, especially when it was my turn to introduce myself. I said, "Hi, I'm Ruth." Everyone replied, "Hi, Ruth." I left there realizing that I did, as Kathleen had said, have a choice. I could continue being miserable and hurting everyone that I loved, or I could finally make a decision to stop. It wasn't that hard a choice to make. 2 days later, I went to another gathering, and this time I went without camouflaging myself. Those few days were a private nightmare. I went cold turkey, and for days and nights my nerves rattled against the surface of my skin. Kathleen wanted me to experience the really awful shock of my body returning to normal, and I did. I endured all the shakes and sweats. I didn't sleep. Kathleen, her husband, and Roger supported me around the clock. It was all kind of rough, but eventually I said, "Hey, if I can do this, if I can say no, there is nothing I can't do. Nothing in the world." And what if something frightens me? Big deal. I'll just take it one step at a time, one day, 1 hour, one moment, whatever it takes. Because if it doesn't kill me, it can only make me stronger. I had stopped drinking, and I felt strong and in control. Roger and I had stopped fighting, and I was sure that I had conquered my problem, which turned out to be a false confidence. And I was ready to give my all to helping Daddy. At first, Mother and I and Roger cared for him at home. But after several months, we had to transfer him to a convalescent home. Daddy was getting worse, and he needed more care than we could give him. I felt really guilty, as if I'd failed. But even from his bed, Daddy remained strong, a voice of reason. He said, "You can't worry every second. You've done everything possible. It'll be better." At the same time, I plunged into rehearsals for a totally new nightclub act, which was the best possible medicine for me. Marvin Hamlish, who co-produced with Roger, selected a batch of new songs. Everyone worked really hard to make this show great. There was no question that I would rise to new heights with the innovative opener Roger had dreamt up by fashioning the stage as a carnival. A giant harlequin was positioned at the side of the stage. Its hand was a platform that would lower me from 22 feet above the ground while I sang Eric Clapton's After Midnight. The show debuted at the Sahara Hotel in Lake Tahoe, September 1972. Roger coached the hotel's stagehands, making sure that they understood how the platform operated, which was actually quite simple. Both ends of the platform were attached by guide wires to a single pipe above the stage and raised and lowered like scenery. It worked without a hitch during rehearsals and several performances. During one show, Roger observed the platform rocking a little bit as it was raised. It bumped some wires on each side, but it didn't interfere with anything, nor did it pose a danger. Up to that point, the most difficult part of the engagement had been trying to help our children get ready for the school year. Back home, Tracy was about to start a new private school and was nervous about the change. Roger wanted to accompany her that first day. That was on September 9th, 1972. Roger had never missed one of my performances or given me my 3 Swedish good luck kicks before every performance. And despite all of my superstitions about routines, I didn't mind. It was more important for him to assist Tracy. The early show was as smooth as all the others, yet without anyone telling me, somebody changed the rigging on my platform between shows. They put the front of the platform on one pipe, the back on another. Instead of one pipe, there were now 2. They believed that that would eliminate a minor sway, make it work better, and help them raise the platform more smoothly. As I stepped on the platform, in preparation for the 12:30 show, all around me the dancers and musicians took their positions. I heard our dear friends, Mitzi McCall and Charlie Brill, the comedy team who opened for me, go into their final bit. I nodded to the stagehands, and they grabbed the guide wires and took me up into the air. I got up about 22 feet in the air, almost to the top. Mitzi and Charlie left the stage, and the curtain parted slightly. At that moment, the pipe balancing the front part of the harlequin's hand went out of sync with one and back. Suddenly, the platform flipped upside down. All I remember is the start of the fall and seeing the floor coming towards me. Whatever else I know of the incident is what people have told me. Charlie remembers hearing a crack, then a scream that came from one of my singers who saw me fall and hit the stage. There was an announcement over the house PA, "Is there a doctor in the house?" Unconscious, I was sprawled out under the fabric of my yellow chiffon dress, lying face down, crumpled and broken. Walter Painter, our director-choreographer, realized that something was dreadfully wrong. He ran backstage. A pool of blood formed under my head and flowed onto the stage. The hotel nurse appeared. Then a doctor materialized from the audience. Walter asked what they should do, and the doctor said to turn me over. The nurse turned me over and took my pulse. She said, "We're losing her, we're losing her." For several moments, I guess people thought I was going to die. Walter's assistant, Bobby Thompson, dashed into the huddle, having remembered that there was a wire hanger in the hood of my cape, and pulled it off my neck. My foot moved. The nurse continued to monitor my pulse. "It's coming back. I feel her pulse getting stronger." While we waited for an ambulance, my friend Marcia called Roger at home in L.A. He happened to be with her then-husband, Daniel Gottlieb, our lawyer. At first, Roger thought she was joking when she said that I'd had a terrible fall. Marcia burst into tears, and she said, "I don't know what's wrong. She's on the stage, not moving, blood's coming out of her mouth, her ears. It's horrible. You have to get here and do something." It was almost 1 a.m., which was too late for Roger to catch a commercial flight. It was also too late to rent a plane. Neither Roger nor Daniel had any idea of what to do, but both knew that they had to get to Lake Tahoe right away. He and Daniel rushed to the Burbank airport only to find it closed. But Roger knew that it was possible to start some small planes without a key. All you needed was an unlocked door. With a light rain coming down, they climbed a chain-link fence, made it over barbed wire, and frantically checked planes until they found one that was both open and filled with gas. As they took off, neither Roger nor Daniel thought about the fact that they were actually stealing a plane. Roger flew most of the way under heavy clouds, dangerously low, without any help from air traffic control, until he found an opening. He gambled that there would be a clearing above Lake Tahoe. Luckily, there was, and the moon's reflection on the water guided him in. On the ground, they sped to the hospital and corralled the doctors who were treating me. Though briefed on my condition, Roger apparently still wasn't prepared for what he saw in intensive care. My face was collapsed and swollen beyond recognition. Numerous bones in my face and above my eye were either broken or fractured. My jaw was broken in 2 places. My left arm was broken. There was a gash on my knee, which had split open like a tomato. The doctors feared I'd never dance again if I survived. First, they needed to stabilize me. Then they'd start repairing the broken bones in my face. Roger and Daniel gazed at me while listening to the doctors. Roger was ready to say, "Okay, just fix everything and make her better." But then Daniel interrupted. Noticing that somehow the skin on my face was unbroken, he asked if the surgery they planned would leave any scars, and if so, was it possible to go through my mouth? In other words, do the surgery without cutting her cheek, leaving the skin unmarked. They said no. Daniel remembered an article he had read on facial surgery that had mentioned going through the mouth. He and Roger talked and decided to call their doctors to find the names of plastic surgeons who could do the surgery without slicing my cheek. Though it was after 3 a.m., they started calling doctors in New York and L.A. Somehow, they got a hold of Dr. Frank Ashley at UCLA, told him what had happened, explained what they wanted, and he said yes, he could do the operation through the mouth. The Lake Tahoe doctors obviously objected when Roger told them that he'd hired an ambulance plane to take me back to L.A. They told him flat out that he was jeopardizing my life by moving me. I was unconscious. What did he think the changing pressure of an airplane was going to do? The doctors were adamant. They said she could die, and you'll be responsible for her death. One of the doctors called the owners of the ambulance plane and explained the situation. He scared them, warning that they would be liable, and they canceled the plane. Roger was infuriated, but he decided to proceed anyway. He and Daniel picked me up, ignoring the protestations of the nurses, slowly carried me out to the car, and then drove to the airport where they had parked their stolen airplane, a 6-seater, small and cramped. In order to fit me in, they ripped out 5 of the seats, tossing them on the tarmac, and then gingerly placed me on the floor. They immobilized me as best they could by packing each side with sleeping bags. Just as they finished, a doctor ran onto the airfield to make a final, futile plea to stop. Roger started the engines, screamed at him to get out of the way, and taxied onto the runway, while Daniel sat on the floor holding my head as still as possible. Both men were scared out of their minds. Because of the bad weather, the flight was bumpy, and Roger changed altitudes more often than he would have if the sky had been clear. He didn't even want to think about what the air pressure was doing to me in this unpressurized cabin. I remained motionless, oblivious to everything, thank goodness. An ambulance waited on the runway as Roger landed the plane. He taxied right to it, and the attendants lifted me out and in seconds sped off. Roger and Daniel hoped that they had done the right thing. Daniel contacted the plane's owner and told him what had happened. Though shocked, he seemed grateful that he could contribute something to this terrible drama. Roger then set off for the hospital. Earlier, he had informed my mother of the accident and told her not to worry, that I'd be just fine. As he drove to meet me, he prayed that he was right. For 2 days, I lay bandaged and unconscious at UCLA Medical Center as Dr. Ashley pondered the best course of action. Then, in an operation lasting 5 hours, he reconstructed my shattered cheekbone. Then I woke up the day after surgery. I had no idea where I was or why I couldn't speak. I looked up and saw Roger, and he explained exactly what had happened. Well, I couldn't talk because I'd broken my jaw in 2 places, of course, and Dr. Ashley put braces on my teeth and laced my jaw shut with wires. My left arm was in a cast, and my leg, which had a gash, was covered by a huge bandage. During my 2nd week in the hospital, Mother arrived for her daily visit and mentioned for the first time that my father was very worried about me. I couldn't believe it. Daddy was in the hospital with terminal cancer, and he was worried about me. I was outraged at myself for adding to my father's burdens. I knew what I had to do. I resolved right then and there to stage the fastest recovery on record and show him that he had no reason to be concerned about me. After 11 days, I was released from the hospital. It took 2 trucks to take home all the beautiful flowers that people I knew and many wonderful, caring souls whom I had never met sent to sweeten my recovery. Roger transformed the den into a makeshift hospital room and hired round-the-clock nurses. He concentrated on raising my spirits. One day he talked about vacationing someplace exotic over Thanksgiving. He asked if there was any place I wanted to go, anywhere in the world. I thought for a moment. Wait a minute, wasn't I supposed to open at the Hilton in Las Vegas on November 28th? You can't be serious. He said, I'm canceling that. Just look at you. You're barely out of bed. You walk with a cane. Your mouth is wired tight as a drum. My voice was muffled. So? You're telling me not to cancel? Yes. My goal was simple. I wanted to show Daddy that I was back to normal and he did not have to worry. Roger put the subject aside. I think he knew how emphatically I felt about this. After 6 weeks, Dr. Ashley felt that I had healed on schedule. He clipped the wires holding my jaw shut. Now, I had expected to be back to normal, but I wasn't. I couldn't open my mouth. Dr. Ashley explained that I had lockjaw, an expected complication. You're going to have to work at it, Ann-Margret. Little by little, you will be able to open your mouth. From Dr. Ashley's office, Roger drove me directly to Daddy's hospital. I made it a point to show him every little bit of progress I made in my recovery. Several weeks later, I made the leap from rehab to rehearsal, though it still was a bit of a hurdle. Walter had me try a simple turn. I got dizzy and had to sit down, but each day I got a little stronger. The show stayed pretty much as before, with one major difference. I entered from ground level instead of riding down on the Harlequin's hand. The week before Thanksgiving, I staged a dress rehearsal in a dance studio in the Valley. I considered it a command performance for Daddy. He was too sick to attend the show in Las Vegas, but Mom brought him to the studio in his wheelchair. I was struck by how little had changed in 31 years. I was still very much the small girl singing and dancing to entertain my parents and win their approval. However, I had only to look at Daddy in the wheelchair to understand that nothing stayed the same. except for one very important thing, which I whispered to Daddy. I love you. When Roger and I left our LA home after Thanksgiving 1972 and headed for the Las Vegas Hilton, we arrived at the hotel several days early to settle in before opening night, November 28th. Elvis happened to be the headliner when we checked in. I regarded Elvis's presence as an extra bonus. Late one night, as Roger and I entertained friends in our suite, Elvis and a few of the guys came by unexpectedly. Despite the crowd, Elvis managed to get me alone at one end of the living room, where we conducted a conversation in hushed voices. It was easy to lapse into the closeness that we had shared, but it was clear from some of his comments that he missed having me in his life. Late that night, the phone rang. Elvis told me how great it had been seeing me earlier. His prayers for my recovery had been answered. But then his tone changed. He asked if he could see me, and I'd hoped he wouldn't ask. I said, "You know I can't." "I know, but I just want you to know that I still feel the same." Then came opening night. As soon as the curtain rose, the crowd welcomed me with a standing ovation. The response really touched me. I read a telegram Don Rickles sent. He said, "Since when do you do a high wire act? Have booked you into Circus with the Flying Walendas. Next time use a net, dummy." As the show moved along, I didn't think I'd finish. Though I tried hiding the shaking, I think the audience knew what I was going through because they didn't seem to want to leave. We had all shared in my return to the stage, and it was a fabulous, glowing feeling. But I was determined to keep going and to grow stronger. After Christmas break, we started rehearsals for a new TV special. In the middle of it, Daddy's illness worsened. Till the end, he stayed true to form, a man who walked gently and bravely through life. He passed away very quietly on February 7th. Afterwards, friends kept a round-the-clock watch over me. I had fallen into such a deep depression that they feared I'd do something desperate, and they were right. One evening, I remembered a bottle of painkillers that I'd shoved into a drawer after my accident. I locked the bathroom door and dumped the bottle of pills onto the counter. I stared at them for a moment, imagining the relief they'd bring. I filled a cup with water and swallowed the pill. Quickly, I gulped the remainder. Very simply, I did not want to be in any more pain. As soon as I began to experience the tingling sensation in my fingers and back caused by the pills, I panicked. I found Roger and told him that I had to see Kathleen. I drove to her home in Santa Monica. Somehow I made it. When I got there, I told Kathleen and her doctor husband, Carl, what I had done. They neither scolded me nor expressed sympathy. Carl asked me what I had taken, then forced me to drink something that immediately made me throw up the pills and cleaned out my stomach. Then he warned me. He said, "I'm never going to do this again." Kathleen added, "Do you know what could have happened to you? Do you want to die?" I said, No, I don't. I just don't know how to handle the pain." She said, "That's what we're here for. If you can't handle something, call us. We'll help you." Which they did. After calling Roger, who was beside himself, they stayed up with me the entire night. The ups and downs continued without let-up. Mother and I grieved together, trying to help each other as best we could. We talked about Daddy all the time, just as we had done when I was a little girl in Bolshevin. Yet there was no reunion that I could look forward to. At 32 years old, I realized I needed some deep soul-searching, and I did something I had never done. I took a sabbatical, 6 months off to regroup. Friends told me that the only way that I could fill the void was to grow inside, and they were right. I had to take time to develop myself as a person, not as a performer. Following a vacation in Mexico, Alan Carr picked Roger and I up at the airport and drove about 10 minutes before pulling over to the side with good news. Ann-Margret, you just got the part of Nora in Tommy. I said, what? He said, it's the rock opera by The Who. It's the hottest script in town. Everybody's in it. Marvin Hamlish knew everything about Tommy and gave me the album. He filled me in on the genius of Pete Townsend and the rest of the band. And of course, he was right about everything. I could tell we were going to have fun when we started shooting in April. In London, Alan arranged for us to rent Michael Caine's flat. I spent the first few days of production trailing Pete Townsend and asking him questions. Since I had never done a film remotely like Tommy, which was like a wild and exaggerated hallucination, I wrote reams of notes and studied them before every scene. Everyone involved in the movie tried to be spontaneous. Imagine the cast of freewheeling characters: Elton John, Eric Clapton, Tina Turner, Oliver Reed, Jack Nicholson, The Who's bassist John Entwistle, and their drummer, Mr. Keith Moon. Keith was so loose, he once slipped a diamond ring off his finger and gave it to me simply because I admired it. Clapton always seemed to fill the background with blues, and somebody was always ready to jam. Director Ken Russell added an exhilarating, inspiring creativity. He was wild, indulgent, kind, and funny, always pushing for more. I was thrilled to be nominated for Best Actress in Tommy. With his second nomination, I had no reason to doubt myself as an actress again, although I don't think I'll ever feel total confidence. I called my mom and told her the good news, and I told my father too. I figured he was listening. In March of 1977, I taped my next TV special called Rhinestone Cowgirl in Nashville. Since I was so close to Memphis, I half expected to hear from Elvis. Someone had told me that he had canceled a recent tour because of illness and was at Graceland. Even when we didn't see each other for stretches of time, there was always a flow of messages. Elvis kept in touch through mutual friends. Lately, I had been very worried about him. During my last engagement in Vegas, while performing at the Tropicana, Joe Esposito came to the show and I questioned him about Elvis's health. I'd heard things that had troubled me. He said, "Don't worry, everything's fine. There are a few problems, but we're taking care of them." I looked Esposito straight in the eye. I knew he was covering for Elvis, and he knew that I knew. If he could have come forward about the difficulties that Elvis was having, I would have been there in a second to intervene. But the matter was kept private. When I opened at the Hilton on August 15th, 1977, there was no guitar-shaped flower arrangement from Elvis. He had not missed an opening in 10 years. I worried in the back of my mind that something was wrong, and I had to make some phone calls the next day. On the morning of August 16th, despite a do not disturb order at the switchboard, our phone rang and Roger answered. It was Shirley Dieu, Joe Esposito's girlfriend. I went into a panic. Something's wrong. It's Elvis, isn't it? I got on the phone and Shirley told me as many of the awful details as she knew. I turned ice cold. Elvis had died. I couldn't speak. I started to cry. I was so distraught I could barely hold the phone, and Roger had to finish the call. Soon after, Joe himself called back. He told me that the funeral was taking place on the 18th, but said that he didn't expect us to be there. He said it's going to be a madhouse, he don't have to come. I knew that I had to go there and say goodbye. I knew deep in my heart that if I had been the first to go, Elvis would have been there for me. We flew to Memphis early the next morning. The entire city seemed in a state of mourning. Some 25,000 people had filed past Elvis's coffin the day before, and another 75,000 stood outside the gate about the time that Roger and I entered the house. The funeral took place in Graceland's living room. Elvis's father and I held each other for a long, long time. There was so much to say, to recount, but instead, we just kept holding each other and cried. Elvis is a part of me, of my happiness and my sorrow, and that will never go away. Elvis and I crossed paths at a time when we were both young, passionate, vulnerable, and idealistic. I treasure the time we were together, and I feel lucky and fulfilled that we were able to sustain such a long, loving friendship. It's rare to have such a friend as Elvis, rare to have such a soulmate. Both Roger and I tried to make things better by pursuing more fun in our lives. If a script or a show didn't sound really good, we said no. I finally understood what Roger meant years earlier when he criticized my first manager for accepting everything instead of waiting for only the best projects. Roger and I were so caught up in activity that it was easy for us to brush aside the subtle warning signs that we might have been going too fast for our own good. Except for my accident, neither of us had been sick since we had begun dating in 1964. Yet Roger had been complaining of fatigue. The fatigue came and went with unpredictable severity, which made us brush it off as a virus. However, as I began working on looking to get out, he stayed relatively stable while I slipped into more immediate danger. During production, I continued an acupuncture program that I had started earlier to increase the chance of getting pregnant, and it seemed to work. 3 different times, twice during the movie, I truly believed that I was pregnant. But each high was followed by a low. The pregnancies all turned out to be false. I became distraught. I was in real pain, and the thought of a drink, which had been on my mind for months, took hold. I drank champagne. I knew I was going to regret it, and I knew it was not going to alleviate the pain. In fact, chances were that it was going to increase the amount of suffering I had to go through. But you don't think logically. I was ashamed. I had gone so long without drinking. I was living in a dark, stormy cloud. Yet while I was telling myself that everything was under control, I couldn't stop my mind from racing. I fixated on having turned 39, the age I always thought that I would retire. I thought about my disappointments in childbearing, and I worried about Roger. About the same time, Roger's bouts of exhaustion and weakness came more frequently. Neither of us knew what was the matter. He promised to make a doctor's appointment, and he never did. It was inevitable that something had to give. One morning, I woke up from a stupor at 4 a.m., and I said to myself, no more. I called Kathleen. Everyone needs an angel. Kathleen was mine. We talked about my frustrations and the way I handled them. I knew I did not want to go on that way anymore, and I didn't. That evening, Roger and I went to dinner and a meeting, my first in months, with several of my supportive friends. That was June 20th, 1980. I haven't had a drink since. With my head clear again, it was Roger I worried about. While Roger plotted a world tour, picture deals, and even the prospect of us finally working together in a limited-run play, his body would not oblige. I was determined to get him to a doctor. We had already inquired about specialists and had an appointment with Dr. Gregory Walsh at St. John's Hospital in Santa Monica. When Roger woke up that morning, he was too weak to make a fist. Somehow he dragged himself to the car and sat next to me in a deep silence as I drove him to the hospital. Tests confirmed our doctor's preliminary diagnosis of myasthenia gravis. This was the same illness that had robbed Aristotle Onassis of his vitality. At least we finally had a name to attach to this dreadful sickness that was crippling Roger. We immediately acquired all the literature we could, and the news was not good. Myasthenia gravis was a rare, chronic disease affecting the transmission of nerve impulses to the muscles they control. Furthermore, the disease was unpredictable and sometimes fatal. Suddenly, our priorities changed. My career was put on hold, and the only thing that mattered was Roger's health. Over the next few months, the disease followed its own erratic blueprint. His neck weakened. He had trouble holding his head straight. He struggled to swallow. It became hard for him to eat. Often he needed liquid to force food down his throat, and occasionally that didn't work, and he'd choke. One morning he woke up gagging. Roger couldn't draw the air into his lungs and then exhale without really concentrating on making each fiber in each muscle do its job. Simply breathing required all his thoughts and energy. Though Roger's condition seemed grim, I never, ever thought that he might not pull out of it. As the months went by, Roger did as much as he could. He tried the drugs Mestinon and prednisone and started a macrobiotic diet. He was re-educated about eating by a nutritionist. On good days, he attempted to move around, even exercise a bit, doing anything he could to give his body a chance to fight back. Slowly but surely, I became a different woman inside. The dependent, shy Ann-Margret slipped away by necessity, and a confident and competent woman blossomed in her place. I could not only perform, but buy stocks and bonds, hire a plumber, and make business decisions. For many women, all this is a given, but for me, it was a quiet triumph, an unexpected good that emerged from a state of crisis. Now, if only Roger would get better. Miraculously, he did. Gradually and almost imperceptibly, Roger's health improved. His breathing got easier. The muscles in his neck had less difficulty supporting his head. In early 1982, we met with doctors at the Mayo Clinic, who put Roger through more tests. He was definitely in remission, the reason he had been feeling better. When Roger's strength appeared to be on its way back, we sat down and made a conscious decision to squeeze every drop of happiness into our lives. There would no longer be any wasting of time. Once Roger was his old self, we began skiing the gorgeous mountains of Aspen, and we scuba dived in Maui. I traipsed through the Egyptian desert in high heels that had sharper points than the Great Pyramids. Roger strode happily by my side. Toward the close of 1983, I stood on the stage of Stockholm's China Theater, where I had made my Swedish debut not long before. This time, I announced my retirement from live performing. Roger and I had talked about it for some time. I was exhausted, but mostly I feared that my performance schedule would further damage Roger's health. Although he was fine now, he had suffered a brief relapse in 1982. After the music faded into the background, we only had each other and our family, and there wasn't any reason to jeopardize that. Between movies and nightclub performances, we had little time to walk the trails that ran across our property at home, and I wanted more time to cuddle. When we returned, we downshifted to a slower speed. As Roger sifted through scripts, we planned on making only one movie a year. It took a lot to entice us out of the comfort of our hilltop refuge. I found myself confronted by a higher authority. Ever since he heard that I had ended my nightclub performances, George Burns had been on my back to reconsider. He had pushed me when I had guested on a TV special celebrating his 80th year in show business in 1983, and he continued to do so when I appeared on a 1986 special honoring his 90th birthday. Annie, do all the dramatic stuff you want. Movies are great. I remember when they were invented. But you're a performer. You gotta get back on stage. But I said, Roger's health. We're being careful. And he said, he looks wonderful. At my age, if you can walk without help, you're healthy. Know what I mean? And I did. As we began to consider his point, I got an offer co-starring in the TV adaptation of Dominic Dunn's novel, The Two Mrs. Grenvilles. The part of Anne Grenville was a woman whose marriage to a very rich young man pits her against his controlling mother. It was irresistible. The other Mrs. Grenville was played by Claudette Colbert. I treasured the opportunity to work opposite one of the really great women of movies. For both Roger and I, it was hard to stay at home. We loved to work, loved being part of an exciting, stimulating, challenging business. Many of our closest friends were people we had met during projects. Burt Reynolds is a good example. We became acquainted with Burt in Toronto when I was making the movie A New Life. Burt wasn't in the film, but he was in the same hotel, directly across the hall from our room. Roger and I knew Burt only in passing, but I had always heard about Burt's wonderful sense of humor. He was among one of the most entertaining storytellers in Hollywood. One night, Roger and I noticed that the light was on in Burt's room, and we invited him for dinner. We discovered a mutual love of sports. Actually, it was more of an obsession, especially with me. Burt, who had played running back at Florida State, was amazed at how much I knew about football, especially the LA Raiders. A man of great passion, Burt chartered a jet the next weekend and flew us all to Florida State University to watch his beloved alma mater in action. Before the game, he and Roger even went onto the field and joined the pregame huddle. It was a great day. Florida State won by some incredible margin. Back in L.A., we started a tradition of spending weekends at each other's houses watching the different games. But there was a serious side to our friendship. Burt had been going through a difficult period since 1984, when he was accidentally hit in the side of the face with an iron chair while making the movie City Heat. He had been in almost 2 years of constant, debilitating pain. By his own admission, Burt's injury transformed him from a fitness buff to someone who had lost nearly 70 pounds and who took sleeping pills daily as an antidepressant. He simply wanted to dull the pain, which was something I certainly understood. As soon as I learned the extent of his dependency, I stepped in and I tried to help. I told him about my problems with alcohol and asked him to call me every time he wanted to take a pill. I saw in Burt's eyes the same look of reassurance and relief that I once felt. He told me that he had always expected his rescuer to be someone like Clint Eastwood. And now this is a quote here. "Not a little Swedish girl, but you're a hell of a lot stronger than anyone knows," unquote. Well, you have to be. I felt Burt could clean up and step back into the spotlight that he so richly deserved. And I was willing to risk our friendship to make sure that he knew that he had the choice. I pushed him to take control of his life, and I'm so glad I did. Slightly more than 8 years had passed since Roger first got sick. We had weathered the intensity of the illness and the recurrence, and once again Roger seemed to be in a state of remission. Total retirement, we knew now, was not the answer. Roger needed the diversion of managing a busy career, and I thrived on activity. The decision was clear. I would return to the stage. About 6 years had passed since I had retired my nightclub act, and both Roger and I were happy to be back. He enjoyed the creative part of shaping the show, from organizing the songs to writing my dialogue, while I knew no substitute for the energy and enthusiasm of a live audience. After opening at Caesars, I realized how right Mr. Burns had been in urging me back on stage. It seemed as if I'd just danced across the stage months earlier instead of years. We toured our show during most of 1989 and 1990. I had no idea what road my career might take me when I left Northwestern on a gamble for a singing job in Las Vegas. For a brief spell, it looked like that road might be a dead end. Then, even after I made a name for myself, my career seemed to be over more than once. Yet, I seemed to have an ability to resurrect myself. I turned 50. There was no reason to carp or complain, to mourn or feel distress. Instead, I felt adventurous and liberated. It was time for a new challenge, and New York had always been my Mount Everest. Let's do Radio City, I told Roger. I want to do it while I still can. While I can still kick. The 6-night, 8-show engagement was launched in mid-October 1991. On October 22nd, my daddy's birthday, the lights dimmed, my stomach twisted in knots. The announcer said how pleased Radio City Music Hall was to present this special event. Lights flashed, the curtain rose, and suddenly, Ann-Margret Olson, the little girl out in the audience, jumped back into her fairy tale. I described to the audience the lifelong impression left by my very first visit to Radio City Music Hall. Then I joined the fabulous Rockettes in a number called How Do You Get to Be a Rockette? As we kicked, I glanced at Roger, who was clapping in his usual spot beside the curtain. Then I saw my mother out front, grinning proudly, and of course, I felt Daddy's presence too. I hoped that somewhere in the audience, maybe somewhere way in the back, there might be a little girl, perhaps a little girl from a foreign country, who was getting her first taste of show business. And I hoped it was magic for her, too. "Congratulations, you did it," Roger said as I came off stage. I did? I don't believe it. But then, despite everything I've done over the years, I still have never taken anything for granted. My story would have been completely different were it not for Roger. People have often asked what has kept us together for almost 3 decades, not only still married, but still really liking each other. Well, I think I've finally figured it out. He concentrates on me, I concentrate on him. And neither one of us is a saint. Yes, sometimes we still fight, have our differences, but we also laugh a lot, fortunately at the same things. Laughter can get you through a lot of things. Many years ago, Peter Allen and Dean Pitchford mentioned that they wanted to write a song for me and asked if I had any suggestions. And I said, just make it dramatic, sensitive, emotional, and personal. They came up with this song called Once Before I Go, which says in just a few lines the way I feel about a lifetime. It goes, "Once before I go, I want you to know that I would do it all again. I'm sure I'd make the same mistakes. I'd even suffer through the pains and joys and aches I suffered then. But I'd do it all. Oh yes, I'd do it all again."
What makes Annie great, she'll always be great. She's a great performer. She not only sells the lyrics, she sells the melody. She's great. I wish she was my daughter. I'd be able to retire. Okay.
Ann-Margret, My Story, was written by Ann-Margret with Todd Gold and read by Ann-Margret. It was abridged for audio by Jill Ellen Riley. Editing and post-production by Dave Levan and Peter Pantelis. The associate producer was Jan Werner. Ann-Margret, My Story, was produced and directed by Susan Perrin Totland.